After walking away from a high-stress career, I bought my $4 million dream beach house in Malibu to finally find peace. But on my very first night, my mother called with a demand that shattered the silence. "We sold our house, and we are moving in with you tomorrow morning. Your father already decided. If you have a problem with it, you can pack your bags and find the streets." My hands shook holding the phone, but I did not cry. I smiled. I had prepared a welcome they would never forget. "My name is Vanessa. I am 34 years old and I used to fix scandals for billionaires." My family had no idea who they were messing with. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart toxic relatives who thought they could walk all over you. The ocean breeze was drifting through the open sliding glass doors of my new living room, carrying the scent of salt and freedom. I was sitting on my balcony with a glass of Cabernet, listening to the waves crash against the shoreline. This house, hidden away in a highly exclusive gated community in Malibu, was my sanctuary. I had just sold my shares in a top-tier crisis management firm for $25 million. For a decade, I had been the person powerful CEOs called when their companies were facing catastrophic scandals, hostile takeovers, or public relations nightmares. I was a master at gathering evidence, anticipating enemy moves, and executing flawless legal strategies. But the burnout had been severe, so I retired early to heal. My family, however, believed a very different story. I had intentionally let them believe I was fired due to a massive failure, knowing that telling them about my wealth would only invite parasites. My phone vibrated on the glass table. The caller ID flashed with my mother's name, Barbara. I took a slow sip of wine before answering. I expected a mundane complaint or a passive-aggressive comment about my supposed job loss. Instead, her voice came through the speaker, sharp, cold, and entirely entitled. "Vanessa, we sold the house," she announced without a single word of greeting. I paused, setting my wine glass down. "What do you mean you sold the house?" "I mean exactly what I said," Barbara snapped, her tone dripping with the condescension she had used on me since childhood. "We finalized the sale today. We have packed up everything and we are moving into your new place tomorrow morning. Your father Richard said your house has plenty of room. We are bringing Mason with us too." My brother Mason, the golden child. At 30 years old, he was a spectacular failure who masked his gambling addictions and massive debts under the guise of being a tech startup entrepreneur. "Mom, you cannot just move into my house without asking," I said, keeping my voice deliberately flat. "I bought this place for my own peace and quiet." Barbara scoffed loudly into the receiver. "Do not use that tone with me. You are unemployed and depressed. You need family around you right now anyway. Your father already decided this is happening. We are arriving at dawn. And listen to me very carefully, Vanessa. If you do not like it, you can pack your bags and find somewhere else to live. You do not get to be selfish when your family needs a place to stay." The sheer audacity of her threat hung in the air. She was telling me, a 34-year-old woman, that I would be kicked out of a $4 million property that I legally owned if I did not submit to their invasion. A normal person would have screamed. A normal person would have argued, threatened to call the police, or completely broken down. I did none of those things. I simply said, "I understand, Mom. See you tomorrow." I ended the call and set the phone face down. My hands were shaking slightly, not from fear, but from a surge of pure, calculated adrenaline. The familiar chill of my crisis management instincts washed over me. I had dealt with ruthless corporate raiders who tried to steal entire companies. My parents and my brother were just amateurs stepping into a very sophisticated trap. I picked up my laptop and walked back inside the house. When I renovated this property, I did not just upgrade the kitchen and the bathrooms. I had installed a state-of-the-art military-grade security system. There were 4K resolution cameras hidden in the crown molding, integrated into the smoke detectors, and perfectly concealed inside the HVAC vents in every single room except the bathrooms. They recorded both high-definition video and crystal-clear audio directly to an encrypted cloud server that only I had access to. I sat at the kitchen island, my fingers flying across the keyboard. I recalibrated the motion sensors, ensuring every common area, the living room, the kitchen, the hallways, and the master suite were actively recording. I set up automated alerts to ping my phone the second any property damage occurred. If they wanted to play games with my home, I was going to document every single violation. I smiled into the glow of the screen. They thought they were moving in to exploit a depressed, unemployed daughter. They had no idea they were walking directly into a surveillance grid managed by a woman who destroyed people for a living. The next morning, the tranquility of my neighborhood was shattered by the grinding brakes of a massive U-Haul truck. It mounted the curb, crushing a row of expensive landscaping plants before coming to a violent halt in my pristine driveway. I stood at the top of the stairs watching the chaos unfold. Richard jumped out of the driver's side, barking orders at the air. Barbara emerged from the passenger side, immediately waving her hand in front of her face as if the ocean breeze offended her. Then the back of the truck opened and Mason leaped out. He was not alone. He was holding the leashes of two massive untrained mastiffs. The dogs were barking wildly, pulling Mason forward as he struggled to control them. They did not knock. Richard pushed the front door open and the invasion began. The dogs immediately dragged Mason into the foyer, their muddy paws tracking thick black dirt all over my custom white Italian wool rugs. "Watch the walls," Richard yelled, dragging a heavy wooden dresser through the front door and scraping it against the pristine white paint. Barbara walked in, dropping her designer knockoff purse on my marble kitchen counter. She looked around with a critical eye, completely ignoring my presence. "It is a bit drafty," she complained, "and the decor is incredibly sterile. We will need to change all these curtains." Before I could speak, Mason pushed past me on the stairs. The dogs knocked against my legs, nearly sending me tumbling backward. He marched straight down the second-floor hallway and pushed open the double doors to the master suite, the room with the panoramic ocean view, the room where my belongings were clearly unpacked. I followed him into the room. Mason dropped the dog leashes and walked straight to the walk-in closet. He grabbed my expensive Toomey suitcase, threw it on the floor, and literally kicked it out into the hallway. The heavy luggage slammed against the wall, leaving a dent in the drywall. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "This is my room now," Mason said, throwing himself onto my king-size bed with his dirty shoes still on. "I am running a startup, Vanessa. I need the ocean view for my mental health and for my investor video calls. You can take whatever room is left downstairs." Barbara appeared in the doorway, crossing her arms over her chest. I looked at her, gesturing to my suitcase on the floor. "Mom, he just kicked my things into the hall. This is my bedroom." Barbara rolled her eyes, unleashing the psychological manipulation I had endured my entire life. "Stop being so dramatic, Vanessa. You just got fired. You do not need a luxury suite to sit around and be depressed all day. Mason is building a business. He is the only one in this family with real prospects right now. You should be supporting your brother, not acting like a selfish child." "But I own this house," I stated plainly, planting the verbal seed for the security cameras to record. Richard stepped up behind Barbara, his face red with unearned authority. "Do not disrespect your mother. We are family and family shares. You owe us this house anyway. Have you forgotten how we emptied our savings account to pay your college tuition 15 years ago? We sacrificed everything so you could get a degree, and you repaid us by getting fired and becoming a failure. Without us, you would be nothing." It was the same manipulative lie they had used for over a decade. They conveniently ignored the fact that I had paid back that tuition loan tenfold within my first 3 years of working in the corporate world. I had bought them cars, paid off their credit cards, and funded Mason's earlier failed business ventures, until I finally cut them off financially 2 years ago. They had always treated me as their personal bank account, and now they were trying to claim ownership of my home through sheer emotional terror. I looked at Mason, whose dogs were currently chewing on the leg of a custom mahogany nightstand. I looked at Richard, who was acting like he held the deed to the property. And I looked at Barbara, whose face was twisted in a mask of arrogant entitlement. A lesser woman would have engaged in a screaming match. I would have demanded they leave, called the police, and caused a massive scene that they would later spin to make me look crazy and unstable. But I was not a lesser woman. I was a crisis manager. I knew that arguing with narcissists without a legally binding trap was a waste of breath. I simply nodded, my expression completely blank. "You are right, Mom. I will move my things downstairs." Barbara smirked, exchanging a victorious look with Richard. "See, was that so hard? Now go make us some coffee." The drive was exhausting. I picked up my suitcase from the hallway, gathered my laptop from the kitchen island, and walked away. I bypassed the other beautiful guest rooms on the second floor and went straight down to the smallest windowless guest room on the ground floor, located right next to the garage. It was cramped and dark, but it had a solid lock on the door. I walked inside, locked the heavy wooden door behind me, and set my laptop on the small desk. I opened my messaging app and texted Diana, my best friend, and one of the most ruthless real estate attorneys in California. "The mice are in the trap. Begin the documentation." Diana replied almost instantly. "Clock is ticking. Do not intervene. Let them dig their own graves." I opened the security dashboard on my laptop screen. The monitor split into 16 high-definition grids displaying every angle of my home in real time. I put on my noise-canceling headphones, shutting out the physical sounds of their invasion, and focused entirely on the digital feeds. I watched as Richard dragged a heavy iron-bound trunk across the pristine hardwood floors of the living room. He did not bother to lift it. I watched the thick wood splinter and tear, leaving deep, jagged gouges across 30 feet of expensive flooring. I opened a spreadsheet on my second monitor. I logged the time, the camera angle, the specific action, and typed in the estimated repair cost for the hardwood floors. $12,000. On the kitchen camera, I watched Barbara open my massive double-door refrigerator. She began pulling out my expensive organic produce, imported cheeses, and premium proteins. Without a second thought, she threw hundreds of dollars worth of fresh food directly into the trash can, making room for the cheap diet sodas and frozen microwave dinners she had brought in a cooler. I logged the incident. Food destruction. Estimated value, $800. Upstairs in the master suite, the cameras caught Mason letting his massive dogs jump onto the bed. They began tearing at the silk duvet cover, ripping the expensive fabric to shreds with their teeth. Mason just laughed, pulling out his phone to record a social media video of himself posing in front of my ocean view, pretending he owned the property. I logged the bedding destruction. Estimated value, $4,000. Every scratch, every broken item, every boundary crossed was meticulously recorded. I was not just writing down complaints. I was building an ironclad criminal case for malicious destruction of property. I knew the California Penal Code by heart. Once the damage exceeded a certain financial threshold, it was no longer a civil dispute. It became a felony. I sat in the dark, cramped room watching my family destroy my beautiful home. My heart did not ache. My pulse was completely steady. They thought they had broken me. They thought they had asserted their dominance over the scapegoat daughter. They had absolutely no idea that I was quietly calculating the exact length of the rope they needed to hang themselves. The trap was set, the cameras were rolling, and my vengeance was going to be perfectly legal, ruthlessly executed, and absolutely devastating. 3 days passed. The house transformed from a sanctuary into a circus of extreme entitlement. Barbara wasted no time establishing her false kingdom. By Thursday afternoon, she had arranged a lavish garden tea party on my oceanfront patio. She used my credit card information, which she had stolen from a piece of mail left on the counter, to hire an upscale catering service. She invited a dozen of the wealthiest residents in the gated community, desperate to cement her status among the Malibu elite. I stayed in the kitchen, dressed in a faded, oversized sweater and loose sweatpants, playing the exact role they assigned me. I brewed the imported tea, arranged the miniature artisanal sandwiches on silver platters, and kept my head down. Through the open French doors, I listened to the masterpiece of delusion unfolding on the patio. Barbara sat at the head of my custom teak dining table, wearing a wide-brimmed sun hat and a silk dress she had undoubtedly purchased with my stolen funds. She poured Earl Grey tea into my imported porcelain cups, laughing loudly at a joke made by a neighbor named Patricia. The ocean breeze caught the sheer fabric of the patio umbrellas, creating a picture-perfect suburban illusion. "It is just so peaceful here," Barbara declared, gesturing broadly toward the Pacific Ocean. Richard and I looked at properties in Beverly Hills for months, but we wanted something closer to the water for our retirement. When we saw this estate, we simply had to buy it. We paid cash, of course. Mortgages are such a tedious headache. I stood by the kitchen island, meticulously wiping down the marble surface while my audio recording app captured every single syllable. The sheer volume of her lies was staggering. She was claiming cash ownership of a $4 million property while currently facing eviction from her previous rental home due to months of unpaid bills. A neighbor named David, an older gentleman who carried himself with strict authority, looked toward the kitchen. He noticed me carrying a tray of fresh blackberry scones toward the patio doors. "And who is the young woman helping out today?" David asked politely, adjusting his glasses. "Is she a housekeeper you hired locally? We have been looking for reliable help since our staff moved away." The patio fell completely silent. I stepped through the glass doors, placing the heavy silver tray on the table. I kept my eyes lowered, letting my hair fall forward to hide my face. I rounded my shoulders and kept my movements hesitant, perfectly executing the posture of a broken, defeated woman. Richard let out a heavy, theatrical sigh. He placed a hand over his heart, shaking his head with a perfectly rehearsed look of deep parental sorrow. "I wish she was just a housekeeper," Richard said, his voice dripping with fake tragedy. "That is our eldest daughter, Vanessa." Patricia gasped softly, her hand flying to her chest. "Oh my goodness, I am so sorry. I did not mean to intrude on a private matter." "It is quite all right," Barbara chimed in, adopting a tone of noble martyrdom. "We are very open about our family struggles. Vanessa is going through a terrible mental breakdown. She was recently fired from her job after a complete professional disaster. She lost everything because she simply could not handle the pressure of the real world. We had to step in and rescue her from living on the streets." I stood frozen by the table, my hands clasped tightly together in front of me. Every word they spoke was a calculated strike designed to elevate their social standing by standing directly on my neck. They were painting me as a pathetic charity case in my own home. "She suffers from severe depression and anxiety," Richard added, lowering his voice conspiratorially as he leaned closer to David. "It is a tragedy, really. We spent a fortune on her college education, hoping she would make something of herself. But she lacks the drive. She lacks the basic resilience to survive. We bought this large estate specifically so we could keep a close eye on her. We gave her a small room downstairs so she would not hurt herself wandering the halls at night. We are doing everything we can to rehabilitate her shattered mind." The wealthy neighbors exchanged highly sympathetic glances. They murmured words of encouragement, praising Barbara and Richard for their incredible parental devotion. "You two are absolute saints," Patricia said, reaching over to pat Barbara on the hand. "Taking in a troubled adult child is such an enormous burden. Many parents would have turned their backs and sent her to a facility. It takes a special kind of love to sacrifice your retirement peace for a sick daughter." Barbara wiped an invisible tear from the corner of her eye, her performance worthy of an award. "Family is everything, Patricia. No matter how much of a massive disappointment she has become, we could never abandon our own flesh and blood. We just pray she gets better, though the doctors say her condition is deteriorating rapidly." The doctors. Another brilliant, actionable fabrication. My analytical mind processed the data while I maintained my blank stare. They were planting the seeds for their ultimate trap. By convincing the entire neighborhood that I was mentally unstable and rapidly declining, they were setting the stage to file for legal guardianship. They wanted witnesses. They wanted wealthy, respected members of the community to testify that I was a danger to myself and incapable of managing my own assets. Mason strutted onto the patio just then, wearing a tailored linen suit and holding a glass of expensive scotch he had raided from my private cellar. He smiled brightly at the guests, exuding the fake charm of a wildly successful entrepreneur. "And this is our son, Mason Richard," announced, his voice instantly shifting from sorrowful to booming pride. "He is the CEO of a revolutionary tech startup. He is actually hosting a major investor gala right here this weekend to close his next round of funding." Mason shook hands with David and Patricia, playing the part of the golden child flawlessly. "It is a pleasure to meet you all," Mason said smoothly. "I am just glad my company allows me to work remotely so I can help my parents take care of my sister. It is a heavy financial and emotional burden on them, but we manage. In fact, if any of you are interested in groundbreaking tech investments, I would love to pitch you my software at the gala." He was trying to hustle them right there on my patio. I kept my head bowed, but underneath the curtain of my hair, my eyes were sharp and my mind was racing. They were wrapping the noose around their own necks with astonishing speed. California law takes elder abuse and fraud very seriously, but attempting to fraudulently declare a competent adult mentally incapacitated to steal their real estate was a massive federal offense. Adding an illegal securities pitch on top of it was just a beautiful bonus. I turned around silently and walked back into the kitchen, acting like a ghost haunting my own house. I did not slam the door. I did not scream or throw a tantrum. I pulled my phone from my sweatpants pocket and sent a quick text to Harrison, my private investigator friend. "The narrative has been planted. They just claimed ownership of the property, declared me mentally incompetent in front of multiple witnesses, and Mason is already soliciting unaccredited investments. Get the background checks on the HOA board members attending this tea party," Harrison replied instantly. "Backgrounds acquired. The man they are talking to right now, David, is a retired federal judge. You could not have written a better script." A cold, genuine smile spread across my face. My parents thought they were securing their high society status. They thought they were building a wall of lies so thick that I would never be able to break out of it. But they had just confessed to a premeditated fraud scheme in front of a retired federal judge who served on the community board. I picked up a damp cloth and began wiping the counters again. Let them drink their tea. Let them play their roles. The higher they built their pedestal of lies, the harder the concrete would feel when I finally pulled the rug out from under them. I loaded a second silver tray with a fresh batch of macaroons and a pitcher of iced lemon water. I needed to solidify the narrative they were selling. If they wanted a medically incapacitated dependent, I would give them an Oscar-winning performance. I deliberately smudged a bit of flour on my cheek and let my hands tremble slightly as I gripped the handles of the tray. I slowed my breathing, dulling the sharp focus in my eyes until they looked vacant and thoroughly medicated. I shuffled back onto the patio. The lively chatter dipped the moment I appeared. I kept my gaze fixed firmly on the teak floorboards, dragging my feet just enough to look exhausted. "Here is more water, Mom," I said, my voice barely above a raspy whisper. I let the tray clatter a little too loudly against the glass tabletop, purposely knocking over a small spoon. Barbara sighed heavily, exchanging a long, suffering look with Patricia. "Thank you, Vanessa. Just put it down carefully. We do not want another accident like yesterday." There was no accident yesterday, but I played along. I shrank back, wrapping my arms around my torso, as if her words were physical blows. "I am sorry. I am just so tired." "It is the medication," Richard explained to David in a loud stage whisper. "It keeps her docile but completely ruins her coordination. It breaks my heart to see my brilliant girl reduced to this." I knelt to pick up the fallen spoon. This was my window. Tucked inside the palm of my left hand was a military-grade micro-audio transmitter. It was no larger than a coin, coated in industrial adhesive and equipped with a battery that would outlast their entire scam. As I bowed my head, apologizing profusely to the guests for my clumsiness, I pressed my left hand firmly against the underside of the heavy teak table. The device locked into place instantly. "Leave it, Vanessa," Mason snapped, swirling his scotch. "You are embarrassing us. Just go back to your room and rest." "Okay," I mumbled, keeping my head down. "I will go." I turned and retreated, shuffling back through the glass doors. I could hear Patricia whispering about how tragic it was to see someone so young look so completely hollowed out. David muttered something about knowing a highly rated psychiatric facility in the valley. The bug under the table was already broadcasting crystal clear audio directly to my encrypted server. I had captured their entire scheme in front of community witnesses, but I needed more. I needed the unfiltered behind closed doors conversations. I needed to hear their exact timeline. I spent the rest of the afternoon locked in my cramped ground floor room, monitoring the audio feeds. The tea party eventually wrapped up. The wealthy neighbors departed with promises to support Mason's upcoming investor gala. As soon as the front door clicked shut, the fake polite voices of my family vanished, replaced immediately by their true venomous tones. "Those snobs ate it right up!" Barbara cackled, the audio perfectly transmitting to my headphones. "Did you see Patricia's face? She practically wants to nominate me for Mother of the Year." "The retired judge is the real prize," Richard said. "Having David on our side when we file the guardianship papers will fast-track the whole process. No judge is going to question an endorsement from him. Just make sure she stays out of the way until the gala," Mason added. "I have 3 huge fish coming on Saturday. If I can close even one of them, I can pay off the guys in Vegas and get them off my back. But I need this house looking like my personal asset." "Do not worry about your sister," Barbara replied. "I will increase the dosage on those sleeping pills she thinks are vitamins. She will be a vegetable by the time your guests arrive." My blood ran ice cold, but my mind remained razor sharp. They were not just manipulating me. They were actively conspiring to drug me. That crossed the line from civil fraud into criminal assault. Later that evening, after Barbara went up to the master suite to soak in my imported soaking tub, Richard and Mason retreated to the study. This was my father's favorite room. It had rich mahogany bookshelves, a massive leather sofa, and a custom-built humidor. It was where they would discuss the actual financial mechanics of their fraud. I needed a bug in that room. I waited until past midnight. The house grew quiet. I watched the security cameras on my laptop. Richard and Mason had left the study an hour ago, leaving their empty scotch glasses and cigar ash all over my antique desk. They were heavy sleepers, especially after drinking my expensive liquor. I slipped out of my room, moving through my own house with the silent precision of a shadow. I wore dark clothes and avoided the areas where I knew the floorboards might creak. I bypassed the kitchen and headed straight for the study. The door was slightly ajar. I slipped inside. The room smelled strongly of cheap cigars and spilled alcohol. I pulled the second microtransmitter from my pocket. I crawled across the Persian rug and slid under the massive leather sofa where my father and brother spent hours lounging. I reached up and pressed the adhesive back of the bug deep into the wooden frame of the sofa, completely out of sight. Even if a cleaning crew scrubbed the floors, they would never find it. While I was under there, my eyes caught something on the floor near the wastebasket. It was a crumpled piece of paper. I pulled myself out and smoothed it over the desk. It was a printed email draft from Mason to an offshore account manager discussing wire transfers and outlining a plan to leverage the Malibu property deed as collateral for a high-interest bridge loan. He had already forged a preliminary appraisal using my property tax documents. I pulled out my phone and took high-resolution photos of the document from every angle. I then carefully crumpled the paper back to its exact previous shape and tossed it back near the wastebasket where I had found it. Never disturb the crime scene before the trap snaps shut. I crept back down this hallway, slipping silently into my small, windowless room. I locked the heavy door and sat back at my desk. I pulled up the dashboard. Now I had eyes and ears in every critical location. The patio bug was active. The study bug was active. The cameras were recording. I opened a secure chat window with Diana. "Audio bugs placed. They are planning to file guardianship papers using the neighbors as character witnesses. They are also planning to heavily drug me before the gala this weekend. Mason is leveraging the house deed for an offshore bridge loan." Diana's response came a minute later. "Let them file. The moment they submit fraudulent guardianship papers to the court, it becomes a federal crime. I am prepping the HOA board injunction. Harrison is tracking the offshore accounts. Keep playing the victim. We strike at the gala." I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair. The darkness of the small room felt comforting. They thought they had backed me into a corner. They thought stripping me of my master suite, my dignity, and my voice would render me helpless. But they failed to realize one crucial detail. In the world of crisis management, the most dangerous person in the room is never the one doing all the talking. It is the one listening. I laid down on the small twin bed, staring at the ceiling. I was ready for tomorrow. I was ready to take their fake pills. I was ready to be the pathetic broken daughter they so desperately wanted me to be. Every insult, every lie, every stolen dollar was just another nail in their coffins. The next morning began the pharmaceutical phase of their operation. I was sitting at the kitchen island staring blankly at a bowl of cold oatmeal when Barbara slid a small plastic cup across the marble counter. Inside were 3 heavy sedatives masquerading as premium dietary supplements. "Take your vitamins, Vanessa," Barbara instructed, her voice laced with that sickeningly sweet maternal poison. "The doctor said you need these to stabilize your mood." I picked up the pills with trembling fingers. I raised the glass of water to my lips, tossing the pills to the back of my mouth, and swallowed hard. Barbara smiled approvingly and turned away to check her reflection in the microwave door. The moment she broke eye contact, I coughed the pills into my napkin, slipping the crumpled paper into my sweatpants pocket. "Good girl," Barbara said, turning back. "Now go down to your room. Mason has an important video conference, and we cannot have you wandering around looking like a zombie." I shuffled back to my windowless bunker, locked the heavy door, and spat the dissolving pills into the small trash can. I rinsed my mouth with bottled water. They were escalating their timeline. I needed to know exactly what was driving their urgency. I spent the daylight hours compiling the financial data I had photographed from Mason's discarded email draft. But the real breakthrough came just after 2 in the morning. The house was pitch dark. The security dashboard on my laptop glowed with infrared feeds. I saw Richard, Barbara, and Mason filtering into the study. Richard poured a heavy dose of my aged scotch. Mason was pacing frantically, dragging his hands through his hair. I slipped my noise-canceling headphones over my ears and boosted the audio gain from the micro-transmitter hidden beneath their leather sofa. They called again. Dad Mason's voice crackled through the feed, high-pitched and vibrating with pure, unadulterated panic. "They know I am in Malibu. They said if I do not have the first installment by Monday, they are going to start breaking fingers." "Keep your voice down," Richard hissed. The clinking of ice cubes against glass echoed sharply through my headphones. "You told me the algorithm just had a glitch. You told me the investors were just getting impatient." "There is no algorithm," Mason shouted, his voice cracking under the strain. "It is a Ponzi scheme, Dad. It has always been a Ponzi scheme. I was paying the old investors with the new investors' money, but the well dried up. The Feds started asking questions, so I had to borrow from the private equity guys in Vegas to cover the massive withdrawals." "Private equity!" Barbara's voice trembled, completely devoid of her usual arrogant bravado. "Mason, you promised me those men were legitimate venture capitalists. They are loan sharks," Mom Mason fired back. "Russian syndicate offshoots. I owe them $2 million. $2 million. They do not care about business plans or pitch decks. They care about their cash. They already repossessed my car, and they know exactly where we are sleeping tonight." I sat perfectly still in the dark, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. The pieces of the puzzle slammed into place with breathtaking clarity. This was not just a greedy family trying to live comfortably off a successful relative. This was an active criminal conspiracy driven by mortal terror. "We lost everything trying to cover your initial losses." Richard groaned, the sound of a man crumbling under the weight of his own enabling parenting. "We did not sell our house, Barbara. The bank took it. We are bankrupt. We have $70 in our checking account and maxed out credit cards under Vanessa's name. Which is why we need this house." Mason slammed his hands down on my antique mahogany desk. "This property is worth $4 million. If we get her to sign the power of attorney, I can leverage the deed by Saturday night. I have a shadow broker ready to wire $2 million against the equity. I pay off the syndicate, and we use the rest to flee to a non-extradition country." "What about Vanessa?" Barbara asked. Her voice did not hold a shred of maternal concern. She sounded like someone calculating the disposal of a broken kitchen appliance. "We leave her," Mason said coldly. We get the money, we leave the country, and the bank forecloses on this place when the loan defaults. She can rot in a state facility for all I care. It is her fault anyway. If she had just stayed in her corporate job and kept funding my company, I would never have had to borrow from the mob. The audacity was almost artistic. My brother was facing dismemberment by a criminal syndicate because of a failed Ponzi scheme. My parents were entirely bankrupt, and their grand survival strategy was to drug me, steal my $4 million estate, and abandon me to institutionalization while they fled the country. I opened my encrypted chat window with Harrison. I typed with rapid surgical precision. Mason's tech startup is a confirmed Ponzi scheme. He is in debt for $2 million to a Russian syndicate loan shark operation out of Las Vegas. They are threatening physical violence. He plans to use a shadow broker to leverage my property deed this Saturday to pay them off and flee the country. Harrison's reply popped up 30 seconds later. I am pulling the Vegas syndicate files now. If he is dealing with who I think he is dealing with, these guys do not send collection letters. They send enforcers. I will alert the Financial Crimes Division at the FBI to flag any unauthorized title transfers on your property immediately. Do not block the transfer yet. I typed back, a cold, genuine smile touching my lips. Let Mason initiate the wire fraud. Let him contact his shadow broker. Let him sign the federal documents. We need the ink to dry on his felony before we drop the hammer. You are ruthless, Harrison replied. I am managing a crisis, I corrected. I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair. The darkness of my cramped room no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a command center. My family was operating under the delusion that they were the predators, and I was the prey. They had spent their entire lives treating me as collateral damage, a disposable asset, meant to shield Mason from the consequences of his own spectacular incompetence. They thought dragging a depressed, unemployed woman into their criminal web would be effortless. But I was not depressed, I was not unemployed, and I was certainly not a victim. I was the architect of their impending destruction. I closed my eyes, listening to the rhythmic crashing of the ocean waves outside, ready to let them dig their graves just a little bit deeper. The next morning brought a terrifying shift in their strategy. They were moving from mere financial theft to outright legal captivity. Sitting at my desk with my headphones firmly in place, I intercepted a new conversation from the study. This time, Richard had someone on speakerphone, a lawyer. I turned up the volume on my audio feed. The lawyer sounded sleazy, his voice slick with practiced deceit, as he explained the process of a California conservatorship. You need undeniable proof of her mental incapacity, the lawyer stated. The courts do not just hand over control of an adult's assets without a compelling medical or psychological reason. Barbara chimed in immediately, her tone eager and ruthless. We have been heavily medicating her for days. She is completely docile. We also have wealthy neighbors who saw her yesterday and are ready to testify about her erratic depressive behavior. She is a danger to herself. The lawyer hummed in agreement. That is a solid foundation. However, a court battle can take months. If you need leverage over her property immediately, a signed power of attorney is significantly faster. You can use the threat of the conservatorship to force her hand. If she refuses to sign the POA willingly, we file the emergency petition and have her committed for a psychiatric evaluation. Once she is locked in a ward, she will do whatever you say. I downloaded the audio file immediately. My pulse remained steady, but my mind was operating at maximum velocity. This was a premeditated conspiracy to commit medical and legal fraud. They were not just trying to steal my house. They were planning to strip me of my fundamental civil rights, lock me in a psychiatric facility, and steal my entire net worth while I was trapped behind locked doors. I opened my encrypted portal and attached the audio file, sending it directly to Harrison. Listen to this, I typed. They are planning a hostile legal takeover. They want to declare me mentally incompetent and commit me to a psych ward if I refuse to sign a power of attorney over my estate. Harrison replied within a minute. This is a felony conspiracy. This crosses every line. Do you want me to call the authorities and have them pulled out of the house right now? No, I responded. We need the final nail in the coffin. I need you to pull every single tax return Mason has filed for the last 5 years. I want his bank records, his offshore shell companies, and the exact paper trail of his tax evasion. I want to know exactly how much he lied to the federal government. I took a breath and continued typing. Also, I want a complete roster of his victims, every single person who lost money in his Ponzi scheme. Find their names, their contact information, and their legal representatives. Leave no stone unturned. I sat back and watched the blinking cursor on the screen. As a crisis manager, I knew that the best way to destroy a fraudster was not to fight them in the shadows. It was to drag their sins into the blinding light of day. Mason wanted to host a lavish housewarming gala this weekend to impress new victims. I was going to make sure his old victims had front row seats. Within 2 hours, Harrison sent a heavily encrypted file back to my secure server. It contained a devastating financial autopsy. Mason had not just scammed wealthy venture capitalists who could afford to take a loss. He had ruthlessly drained the retirement funds of elderly couples. He had stolen from small business owners who trusted his fake projections. He had funneled all the stolen cash through dummy corporations in the Cayman Islands, blatantly lying to the IRS and dodging millions in federal taxes. The scope of his cruelty was staggering. He had ruined dozens of lives to fund his sports cars, designer suits, and gambling addiction. Send an anonymous, highly secure invitation to every single victim on that list, I instructed Harrison. Tell them Mason is hosting an exclusive investor gala at my Malibu estate this Saturday night. Tell them he will be displaying his wealth, pouring expensive champagne, and securing new funds. Tell them to bring their lawyers. Harrison sent a smiling emoji. You are going to turn his own housewarming party into a slaughterhouse. He wants to play the successful CEO, I replied. I am simply providing him with the audience he truly deserves. The sound of heavy footsteps approaching my door pulled me from the screen. I quickly minimized the security dashboard, slumped my shoulders forward, and stared blankly at the blank wall. The heavy lock clicked open. Barbara walked in, carrying another dose of her toxic pills and a fresh glass of water. She looked down at me with an expression of pure, unfiltered contempt. You look terrible, Vanessa, Barbara said, her voice dripping with fake pity. Your father and I are extremely worried about your rapid decline. We have contacted a specialist. They say you might need round-the-clock residential care in a facility if you do not improve quickly. I knew exactly what she was doing. It was the psychological warfare the lawyer had advised. I let my lower lip tremble. I wrapped my arms around my knees, rocking slightly on the edge of the small twin bed. Please, Mom, I whispered, forcing my voice to crack. I do not want to go to a hospital. I will be good. I will do whatever you want. Just let me stay here. Barbara smiled, a predatory gleam flashing in her eyes. We want to keep you here with us, sweetheart. We really do. But your father needs to manage your finances, so you do not do anything destructive in your current state. He is having a simple power of attorney document drafted today. You will sign it this weekend in front of our guests to prove you are making a rational choice to accept our help. If you do that, we will take care of you forever. She was offering me a choice between signing away my $4 million estate to save her criminal son or being thrown into a psychiatric ward against my will. It was textbook extortion delivered with a maternal smile. I reached out with shaking hands and took the pills from her palm. I looked up at her with wide, terrified eyes. I will sign it, Mom. I promise. Just please do not send me away. Barbara patted my head as if I were a compliant, broken dog. Good girl. Just rest now. We have a very big weekend ahead of us. She turned and walked out, locking the heavy wooden door behind her. The moment the lock engaged, my terrified expression vanished instantly. I spat the pills into my hand and threw them directly into the trash can. I pulled my laptop back open and brought the security dashboard back to life. The board was fully set. The pieces were moving exactly as I dictated. They thought they were holding a loaded gun to my head, completely blind to the fact that I had already wired the entire building with explosives. The gala was only 2 days away. I was going to let them put on their best suits, pour their stolen champagne, and smile for their guests. And then I was going to burn their entire world to ashes. Friday morning arrived with the heavy click of the deadbolt. My daily routine had now officially become a high-stakes theatrical performance. Barbara marched into my cramped room at exactly 8 o'clock in the morning, holding a small plastic cup containing 4 white chalky pills and a tall glass of water. She had escalated the dosage. The sheer brazenness of her crime was breathtaking. She was not just trying to make me docile, she was trying to chemically lobotomize me. "Time for your medicine, sweetie," Barbara cooed, standing over my bed like a vulture waiting for a carcass to stop twitching. "We need you looking calm and relaxed for Mason's big night tomorrow. These will help take the edge off your little depressive episodes." I had already identified the pills the previous night, after secretly retrieving a dropped one from the hardwood floor. They were heavy prescription-grade sedatives, the exact kind used in psychiatric facilities to subdue violent patients. Mixing them with the sheer amount she was forcing on me could easily cause respiratory failure. She did not care. She just needed a compliant signature on that power of attorney document. I sat up slowly, letting my hands tremble violently as I reached for the plastic cup. I had perfected the sleight of hand over the past 48 hours. I tossed the pills toward the back of my throat, immediately taking a huge gulp of water. But instead of swallowing the medication, I pinned the chalky tablets firmly beneath my tongue. I swallowed the water, loudly opened my mouth for a split second to show it was empty, and offered a weak, subservient nod. "Good girl." Barbara smiled, snatching the empty glass from my hands. "I will be back at noon with your lunch and your afternoon dose. Just sleep." The moment the heavy door locked behind her, I spat the dissolving sludge into a waiting tissue, rinsed my mouth with a hidden bottle of water, and sealed the toxic mess inside a plastic evidence bag. I was saving every single pill. It was physical evidence of attempted poisoning, a Class A felony, that would ensure my mother spent the remainder of her natural life in a federal penitentiary. But simply avoiding the medication was not enough. I had to physically embody the devastating effects of the drugs. A crisis manager knows that optics dictate reality. If they expected a broken, heavily medicated woman, I was going to give them a masterclass in physical deterioration. I stopped washing my hair, letting it hang in greasy, unkempt strands around my face. I used a subtle gray eyeshadow from my makeup bag to hollow out my cheekbones and paint deep, bruised-looking circles under my eyes. I practiced a vacant, unfocused stare in the bathroom mirror. I slowed my breathing, slurred my speech, and forced a severe tremor into my hands. I stopped making eye contact, completely choosing instead to stare blankly at the floorboards whenever I was forced to interact with them. By Friday evening, my performance was yielding spectacular results. My family dropped their guard entirely. Because I appeared to be in a chemically induced stupor, they no longer bothered to lower their voices or hide their conversations when I was in the room. They treated me like a piece of broken furniture. I shuffled into the kitchen to grab a glass of water while Richard and Mason were loudly celebrating over a bottle of my best champagne. Mason was actively bragging to Richard about the massive offshore wire transfer he had queued up for Saturday night. "The shadow broker is locked in, Dad." Mason laughed, clapping Richard on the back. "The second she signs that POA tomorrow night, I email the executed document to my guy in the Caymans. He wires the $2 million directly to the Vegas syndicate by midnight. We take the remaining $2 million, pack our bags, and we are on a private charter to Belize by Sunday morning." Richard swirled his champagne, looking at me with absolute disgust as I dragged my feet across the kitchen tile. "Just look at her," Richard sneered, making no effort to hide his voice. "She does not even know what day it is. It is almost pathetic how easily she broke. We should have taken control of her finances years ago. We could have avoided this whole Vegas mess entirely." "Do not worry about it, Dad," Mason chuckled, leaning against my expensive marble island. "She is going to sign the house away tomorrow, and then she is the state's problem. The psychiatric facility David recommended will take her in the second the bank forecloses on this place. She will be heavily medicated in a padded room, and we will be drinking margaritas on a beach with no extradition treaty." I poured my water, my hands shaking perfectly on cue, and shuffled back out of the kitchen without a single word. Inside, my mind was a fortress of cold, calculating rage. They were discussing my permanent institutionalization with the casual joy of people planning a tropical vacation. They truly believed I was a hollow shell, completely unaware that I was memorizing every detail of their flight risk plan to feed directly to the FBI. Back in my dark room, I locked the door and opened my secure laptop. I had to operate strictly in the dead of night, coordinating the final pieces of the trap with Diana and Harrison while my family slept off their stolen liquor. I typed a rapid update to Harrison. Mason just confirmed his flight risk status. He has a private charter booked for Belize on Sunday morning. He plans to execute the wire transfer at exactly midnight on Saturday, right after he forces my signature. Ensure the federal task force is positioned to intercept the wire and block the airspace. Already on it, Harrison replied. The Vegas syndicate is also getting impatient. We intercepted chatter that they have enforcers moving into the Malibu area. They are not waiting until Monday. If Mason does not pay up tomorrow night, things are going to get violent. That piece of information raised the stakes exponentially. The syndicate was closing in on the house. I was no longer just managing a family fraud case. I was sitting in the epicenter of a mob collection zone. But instead of fear, I felt a profound sense of satisfaction. Mason had backed himself into a corner with literal monsters. Saturday morning dawned with a thick, suffocating tension in the house. This was the day of Mason's grand housewarming gala. The caterers arrived early, setting up extravagant floral arrangements and champagne towers on the patio. The house buzzed with the frantic energy of a major event. Barbara marched into my room at 10 o'clock sharp for my morning dose. She looked immaculate, wearing a tailored evening gown and a diamond necklace that I recognized from my own jewelry box. She had raided my personal safe while I was supposedly unconscious. "Today is the big day," Vanessa Barbara commanded, holding out a plastic cup containing 5 pills this time. She was increasing the dosage to ensure absolute compliance for the signing ceremony. "You are going to come out tonight, you are going to smile for the guests, and you are going to sign the papers your father gives you. Do you understand me? If you embarrass us, I swear I will have the medics drag you out of here in a straitjacket before the appetizers are served." I looked up at her through the greasy strands of my hair. I let my jaw go slack and nodded slowly. "Yes, Mom," I rasped, taking the cup. I performed the sleight of hand, flawlessly securing the 5 heavy sedatives under my tongue and swallowing the water. "Good," she snapped, turning on her heel. "Stay in here until I send for you." I spat the pills into my evidence bag and locked it away. I sat in the dim light of my room, listening to the clinking of crystal glasses and the sound of a string quartet warming up on the patio. The stage was perfectly set. The actors were in position. The audience of victims and federal agents was on its way. The climax of my family's spectacular downfall was only hours away. The heavy lock on my door clicked open once more, shattering the afternoon silence. I did not move from my position on the edge of the bed. I kept my shoulders hunched and my gaze fixed firmly on the floorboards. Richard stepped into the cramped room. He was dressed in a sharp, tailored tuxedo that he had undoubtedly purchased using my stolen credit card. He carried a thick manila folder under his arm. He did not look at me with the concern of a father. He looked at me the way a butcher looks at a prized calf. He walked over to my small desk and slapped the folder down. The heavy thud echoed in the windowless space. "Look at me, Vanessa," Richard commanded, his voice echoing with absolute unearned authority. I slowly lifted my head. I made sure my hands were shaking visibly. I widened my eyes, projecting the hollow, terrified look of a woman who had completely lost her grip on reality. "Inside that folder is a general, durable power of attorney," Richard stated coldly. "It gives me full, unrestricted legal control over your finances, your medical decisions, and your real estate assets. Tonight, when the gala is at its peak, Mason is going to bring a notary public into the living room. You are going to walk out there. You are going to smile politely at our guests, and you are going to sign every single page right where I have placed the sticky notes." I let out a ragged, stuttering breath. "Dad, please," I whispered, forcing my voice to crack perfectly on the final syllable. "This is my house. You cannot take my house." Richard leaned over me, placing his hands on his knees so his face was inches from mine. "Let us get one thing absolutely clear, Vanessa. You do not own anything anymore. You are a sick, unstable woman who cannot even manage to swallow her daily vitamins without spilling water all over herself. You are a danger to yourself and a massive burden to this family. We are doing you a favor by taking this off your hands. I whimpered, shrinking back against the headboard. Richard stood up straight, adjusting his expensive cuffs. If you decide to be difficult tonight, if you shed a single tear, or if you refuse to pick up that pen, I have a medical transport team on standby. Barbara has already spoken to a judge who is a close personal friend of ours. We have testimonies from the neighbors who saw your psychotic episode on the patio. We have records of the heavy antipsychotics you have been taking. He leaned back down, his voice dropping into a vicious, terrifying growl. If you embarrass me tonight, I will sign an involuntary psychiatric hold. They will strap you to a gurney lock, you in a padded room in a state facility, and throw away the key. You will spend the rest of your life eating pureed food through a plastic straw while we manage your estate. Do I make myself perfectly clear? It was time for the grand performance. I slid off the edge of the bed, dropping entirely to my knees on the cold, hardwood floor. I wrapped my arms around my torso and began to hyperventilate. I forced a stream of genuine panicked tears to spill down my cheeks. I sobbed loudly, letting the ugly guttural sounds of absolute despair fill the small room. No, please, I begged, grabbing the hem of his tuxedo pants. Please do not lock me away, Dad. I am sorry. I am so sorry I was a disappointment. Please do not send me to the hospital. I am scared of the hospital. I will sign it. I will sign whatever you want. Just please let me stay here with you and Mom. Please do not abandon me. I buried my face in my hands, rocking back and forth on the floor, weeping hysterically. Barbara stepped into the doorway, her arms crossed over her sparkling evening gown. She looked down at me, writhing on the floor, and a smile of profound, sickening satisfaction spread across her face. She is completely broken, Richard. Barbara sneered, her voice dripping with triumph. Look at her. It is pathetic. I told you she never had the spine for the real world. Get up, Vanessa. You are getting tears on your father's trousers. I scrambled backward, wiping my face with the sleeves of my oversized sweater, nodding furiously. I will sign it, I gasped out between manufactured sobs. I promise. I will be good. I will be so good. Richard chuckled, a deep, arrogant sound of total victory. He reached down and patted me on the head exactly the way one might pat a stray dog. That is my good girl, Richard said smoothly. We are going to take excellent care of you, Vanessa. Just follow the script tonight and everything will be fine. Wash your face. Put on something decent. Mason will come get you when it is time. They turned and walked out of the room together. They did not even bother to lock the deadbolt this time. In their minds, there was no need. A caged animal whose spirit has been utterly crushed does not try to open the door. They were convinced they had achieved total psychological domination. The heavy wooden door clicked shut. Their footsteps faded down the hallway. The moment the sound disappeared, my hysterical sobbing ceased instantly. I stood up from the floor. I wiped the remaining moisture from my cheeks with the back of my hand. I walked over to the small mirror hanging above the dresser and stared at my reflection. The terrified, broken daughter was gone. The apex predator had returned to the surface. I walked over to the desk and picked up the thick manila folder Richard had thrown down. I flipped through the pages of the power of attorney. It was a sloppy boilerplate legal document downloaded from the internet, hastily modified to include my property address. It was legally binding if properly notarized, but it was amateurish. They were so blinded by greed that they did not even hire a real attorney to draft the instrument of their theft. I opened my laptop and bypassed the security firewalls to access my encrypted communication portal. Diana. I typed, my fingers flying across the keys. The bait has been delivered. Richard just gave me the power of attorney. He threatened me with involuntary commitment to a psychiatric ward if I refused to sign. They are so confident they did not even lock my door. Diana responded immediately. That adds criminal coercion and extortion to the list of charges. Harrison is already in position outside the gated community. The HOA board members are arriving in 10 minutes. The victims of Mason's Ponzi scheme are congregating at the staging area down the Pacific Coast Highway. We are ready to breach on your signal. I pulled my gray sweater over my head and tossed it onto the bed. Beneath it, I was wearing a sleek, tailored black silk blouse. I reached into my overnight bag and pulled out a pair of black designer slacks and my signature crimson stiletto heels. I was done wearing the uniform of a victim. I moved to the bathroom and washed the grease and the gray eyeshadow out of my hair and off my face. I applied a sharp, flawless layer of makeup, bold eyeliner, perfect contouring, and a striking shade of dark red lipstick. I brushed my hair until it fell in a sleek, powerful curtain over my shoulders. I looked into the mirror one last time. I was no longer the depressed, unemployed daughter they thought they could manipulate. I was Vanessa, the $25 million corporate assassin, and I was about to go to work. I picked up the manila folder containing the power of attorney, rolling it into a tight cylinder in my right hand. I checked the time on my phone. The guests were mingling. The champagne was flowing. Mason was likely in the middle of his fraudulent pitch. I sent one final two-word message to Diana and Harrison. Move in. I slipped my phone into my pocket, pushed open the unlocked bedroom door, and walked out into the brightly lit hallway. The sound of clinking glasses and arrogant laughter echoed from the living room. It was time to give my family the welcoming party they so desperately deserved. I walked down the brightly lit hallway, my crimson stilettos completely silent on the custom runner rug. Through the sheer architectural glass separating the hall from the main living space, I could see the full magnitude of the spectacle my family had orchestrated. It was not merely a housewarming party. It was a high-production theatrical set meticulously designed to lure fresh capital into a dying scam. Mason had spared absolutely no expense to create the illusion of boundless wealth. A 10-piece string quartet played softly in the corner of the grand foyer, their instruments gleaming under my modern chandeliers. Uniformed waitstaff in crisp white linen circulated with silver trays loaded with beluga caviar, wagyu beef tartare, and truffles. A towering champagne fountain anchored the center of the sunken living room, overflowing with vintage Dom Perignon. The patio doors were thrown wide open to the ocean breeze, revealing floating lanterns illuminated in the infinity pool and a fully staffed outdoor oyster bar. I paused behind a massive marble pillar, staying entirely out of their line of sight, and allowed my analytical mind to tally the costs of their delusion. I knew exactly how this lavish illusion was funded. Earlier that afternoon, while Barbara genuinely believed I was sedated in my room, I had intercepted a rapid succession of high-alert notifications from my primary platinum credit card. It was a card I kept locked in a biometric safe. Barbara had somehow managed to bypass the digital lock, using my discarded mail and highly illegal social engineering tactics over the phone with my bank's customer service representatives. The alerts had painted a sickening, undeniable picture of their absolute desperation and brazen criminality. $50,000 wired to a luxury event planning syndicate based out of Beverly Hills. $12,000 swiped for the rare imported floral arrangements draped across my glass banisters and patio tables. $8,000 authorized for top-tier valet and private security services guarding my front gates. Another $15,000 charged at a high-end boutique to purchase the bespoke suits and designer evening gowns they were currently wearing. They were swiping my stolen card with the frantic, reckless energy of criminals who believed they would never have to face the consequences. They operated under the arrogant assumption that by midnight they would own the entire estate, control all my bank accounts, and have me securely locked away in a psychiatric ward. In their minds, they were just spending their own future money. It was textbook identity theft, compounded by wire fraud, adding a mountain of federal charges to the trap I had already laid. From the shadows of the pillar, I watched Mason actively working the room. He was wearing a tailored Tom Ford tuxedo that my credit score had paid for, holding a crystal tumbler of my oldest scotch and projecting the flawless aura of a Silicon Valley prodigy. He had cornered a group of 3 older, distinguished gentlemen near the edge of the infinity pool. These were his marks, the fresh victims he desperately needed to bleed dry to pay off his Las Vegas syndicate debt before his knees were broken. I tuned my ear to Mason's aggressive pitch, catching snippets of his fraudulent dialogue floating over the string quartet. This property is just a very small reflection of our third quarter growth, Mason boasted, gesturing smoothly toward the private beach access. Our proprietary software is revolutionizing commercial data compression. We are about to go public in the next 6 months. I am keeping the circle very tight, but I wanted to offer a few select friends the opportunity to get in on the ground floor tonight. A minimum buy-in of 500,000 guarantees a massive return by the next fiscal year. It was a masterclass in predatory manipulation. He used the sheer scale of my $4 million home to validate his fake company's valuation. He was selling them smoke and mirrors, backed by the solid foundation of my real estate. Barbara was floating nearby, draped in my stolen diamond necklace, acting as his ultimate hype woman. She approached the wife of one of the targeted investors, holding a crystal flute of champagne with an air of practiced aristocracy. "My son is an absolute genius," Barbara told the woman, her voice loud enough to ensure the investors overheard. "He bought this estate in cash before he even turned 30. We are just so blessed to have a child who takes such incredible care of us. He insists on giving us the best of everything." Richard stood near the custom marble bar, puffing on a Cuban cigar, nodding approvingly as he validated every single lie that fell from his son's mouth. Whenever an investor looked his way for confirmation, Richard offered the proud, steady smile of a successful patriarch. They operated as a flawless predatory unit. They had isolated the wealthy targets, fed them expensive alcohol, dazzled them with stolen luxury, and were now moving in for the financial kill. It was repulsive yet fascinating to watch them execute their con with such effortless sociopathy. They truly believed they were the smartest people in the room. They felt invincible. I tightened my grip on the rolled-up power of attorney document in my right hand. The sheer volume of felonies occurring simultaneously under my roof was enough to put all three of them away for decades. Grand theft, identity theft, securities fraud, conspiracy, and wire fraud. They were digging their graves with golden shovels funded entirely by the woman they thought they had chemically lobotomized. I checked the time on my phone. The digital clock glowed brightly in the dim shadows of the hallway. Harrison and Diana had already confirmed their positions. The federal agents were standing by. The real victims of Mason's previous scams were mingling quietly among the crowd, having slipped past the security gates using the anonymous VIP invitations I had generated. Mason was too busy pitching his new marks to realize the old ones were drinking his stolen champagne. The trap was not just set, the steel jaws were already closing. I took a deep, steadying breath, letting the cold, calculating energy of a crisis manager flood my veins. It was time to give them exactly what they asked for. They wanted me to make an appearance. They wanted the broken, medicated daughter to stumble out into the light and sign away her life. I stepped out from behind the marble pillar, my crimson heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. I did not slouch. I did not tremble. I kept my spine completely straight and my chin held high. I walked directly into the blinding light of the grand living room, ready to burn their empire of lies straight to the ground. As I crossed the threshold into the blinding light of the grand living room, my crisis management instincts took complete control over my physical body. The sharp, confident stride I had envisioned seconds ago instantly dissolved. I knew that to spring a trap flawlessly, the prey must feel a sense of absolute, unchallenged dominance until the very last second. I deliberately buckled my posture, letting my shoulders cave inward. I dragged the toes of my crimson stilettos against the hardwood floor, turning my powerful walk into an erratic, unsteady shuffle. I bowed my head, allowing the sleek curtain of my freshly brushed hair to fall forward heavily, shadowing the bold eyeliner and dark red lipstick I had carefully applied. If my family wanted a broken doll to parade in front of their wealthy marks, I would give them the final pathetic masterpiece they demanded. The lively chatter nearest to the hallway faltered as I emerged. Wealthy guests in custom evening wear parted like the Red Sea, their eyes fixed on the trembling woman clutching a rolled-up manila folder. I wrapped my free arm around my waist, shivering violently as if the ambient temperature of my own home was freezing my bones. I kept my gaze unfocused, letting my eyelids droop heavily to mimic the devastating effects of the 5 industrial-grade sedatives my mother believed were currently coursing through my bloodstream. Barbara spotted me first. She excused herself from the wife of a tech mogul and hurried over the jewels around her neck, catching the light of the chandelier. I saw a momentary flash of panic in her eyes when she noticed my tailored black silk blouse and designer slacks. She realized I had changed out of my baggy sweatpants. But the moment she registered my vacant, glazed expression and my violently shaking hands, her panic melted into an expression of supreme, arrogant victory. She genuinely believed my mind was so heavily lobotomized by her drugs that I had dressed myself in a confused, futile attempt to function normally. She dug her manicured nails into my bicep with bruising force, pulling me close under the guise of a loving maternal embrace. "You actually put on makeup," she hissed directly into my ear, her voice a venomous whisper meant only for me. "You look like a medicated clown trying to go to the prom. Keep your mouth shut, keep your eyes on the floor, and do exactly what we practiced, or I will have you sedated in a padded cell by morning." Then, without missing a single beat, she turned to the staring guests and projected a voice full of tragic, weeping sympathy. "Oh, my brave girl, Barbara," announced loudly, ensuring the entire room could hear her performance. "You managed to get out of bed. We are so incredibly proud of you for joining us tonight." Mason, standing by the edge of the illuminated infinity pool with his investment targets, paused his fraudulent pitch. He looked across the room at me. The sheer, unadulterated contempt on his face was staggering. He took a slow sip of his stolen scotch and shook his head with practiced sorrow. My older sister Mason explained to the three older gentlemen, his voice carrying the perfect pitch of a burdened but endlessly loving brother. She had a complete mental collapse recently. She lost her job, lost her drive, and lost her grip on reality. The medication keeps her stable, but it destroys her motor functions. My parents and I bought this estate just to give her a peaceful place to exist while we manage her daily care. It is a massive financial drain on my company, but you never give up on family. The investors murmured their deep approval, completely moved by the emotional manipulation. One of them actually reached out and patted Mason on the shoulder, praising his remarkable character. It was sickening. They were completely spellbound by the illusion of the golden boy sacrificing his own resources to take care of his shattered sibling. My family was using my simulated deterioration as a psychological tool to build immediate trust with their marks. Richard walked over, puffing on his thick Cuban cigar, radiating the patriarchal dominance he felt he had finally achieved. He placed a heavy, suffocating hand on my opposite shoulder, trapping me between him and Barbara. The visual contrast was entirely jarring. Here were two perfectly groomed, robust parents holding up their trembling ghost-like daughter in the middle of a multi-million-dollar gala. It pushed their arrogance to the absolute zenith. They felt invincible. They believed they were the smartest predators in the room. While I kept my eyes unfocused and aimed at the floorboards, my peripheral vision was actively scanning the environment. I cataloged every face in the crowd. I spotted the undercover federal agents mingling by the catering tables, wearing unassuming luxury suits provided by Harrison. I saw the real victims of Mason's previous Ponzi schemes, standing quietly near the back walls, their expressions tense but tightly controlled, waiting for my signal to strike. And there, standing near the grand stone fireplace, was the man Mason had hired to play the role of the notary public. But it was not the man Mason had hired. Harrison had intercepted the original notary, paid him off, and taken his place. Harrison adjusted his glasses and gave me a microscopic, almost imperceptible nod. The perimeter was entirely secure. The exits were covered. The trap was loaded. My family paraded me through the center of the living room like a trophy of their conquest. Every step I took was deliberately clumsy. I let my breathing sound ragged and uneven, acting as though navigating the room required monumental physical effort. Guests parted ways, offering polite smiles filled with intense pity. I was the cautionary tale of the evening, the high society failure they could all look at to feel infinitely better about their own lives. Barbara guided me to a plush velvet armchair near the center of the room, positioned perfectly under the brightest lights. She forced me to sit. I slumped against the cushions, letting the rolled-up manila folder rest limply on my lap. I stared blankly at the glass coffee table, allowing my jaw to hang slightly slack. Richard stood beside my chair, puffing a cloud of thick smoke over my head. He looked around the massive room, taking in the expensive floral arrangements, the playing string quartet, the flowing champagne, and the wealthy targets, eagerly listening to his son. He truly believed he had won the ultimate prize. He believed that he had conquered my life, stolen my assets, and successfully erased my agency forever. He believed the hard part was entirely over. Mason finished his conversation by the pool, shook hands with the investors, and confidently strode across the living room toward us. He signaled to the string quartet, drawing a finger across his throat. The musicians immediately ceased playing. The sudden silence in the massive house was deafening. Conversation stopped. Every eye in the room turned toward the center right where my family stood surrounding my chair. The contrast could not have been more perfectly orchestrated. The arrogant, triumphant family standing victorious over the fragile, broken woman they were about to legally erase. Mason cleared his throat, projecting his voice to ensure it reached the furthest corners of the vaulted living room. He held his glass of stolen scotch high, adopting the solemn, dutiful posture of a man carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. Friends, partners, esteemed guests. Mason began, his tone perfectly calibrated to elicit maximum sympathy. I want to thank you all for joining me tonight to celebrate the future of my company. But before we return to the festivities, my family has to address a deeply personal matter. As you can see, we are dealing with a tragedy under our own roof. A collective murmur of pity swept through the room. I kept my head bowed, my shoulders violently trembling. Richard stepped forward, positioning himself precisely in the center of the room. He reached down and gently pulled the rolled-up manila folder from my lap. He smoothed the crumpled paper against the surface of the glass coffee table with exaggerated care. He looked out at the affluent crowd, his face a mask of profound parental agony. It breaks a father's heart to see his eldest child reduced to this, Richard announced, his voice echoing in the dead silence of the room. Vanessa was once a bright, capable young woman, but mental illness is a vicious thief. Over the past few months, we have watched her mind completely unravel. She has lost her career, her stability, and her ability to care for herself. My wife and I purchased this estate so she could have a safe, secure environment to heal. Barbara leaned over my chair, placing a manicured hand on my shoulder. Her nails dug sharply into my collarbone, a silent, vicious warning to remain compliant. She dabbed at her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief, playing the role of the devastated matriarch to absolute perfection. The doctors have told us she requires full-time residential care. Richard continued, pacing slowly around my chair like a ringmaster in a circus. Her medications are strong, and her cognitive decline is rapid. To ensure she gets the premium medical treatment she so desperately needs, our family must take over the management of her affairs. It is a heavy burden, but it is what family does. We protect our own. He gestured toward the tall man standing near the stone fireplace. Harrison stepped forward, carrying a professional leather briefcase. He wore a crisp, unremarkable suit, his demeanor appropriately detached and bureaucratic. "This is Mr. Harrison," Richard explained to the captivated audience. "He is a state-appointed notary public. We wanted to do this completely by the book, in the open, surrounded by the people who support us. We are executing a general durable power of attorney, allowing me to manage Vanessa's assets, authorize her medical treatments, and ultimately save her from herself." The sheer level of psychological manipulation was breathtaking. They were using the social pressure of a high society gala to force my hand. In front of retired federal judges, wealthy neighbors, and potential investors, they were staging an intervention. If I screamed, if I fought back, I would simply validate their narrative that I was a hysterical, dangerous lunatic in desperate need of psychiatric confinement. It was a brilliantly constructed trap, assuming the victim was actually helpless. Richard crouched down beside my chair, bringing his face level with mine. He placed a heavy, gold-plated fountain pen on top of the legal documents resting on the glass table. "Vanessa, sweetheart," Richard coaxed, his voice dripping with venomous, patronizing sweetness. Look at me. I slowly lifted my chin. I forced my eyes to dart erratically around the room, mimicking the overwhelming panic of a cornered animal. I let out a soft, broken whimper. I know you are confused right now, Richard continued, speaking to me as if I were a frightened toddler. I know the medication makes everything foggy, but your mother and I love you so much. We cannot let you continue to suffer like this. We need to take over the financial burden so you can just focus on resting. You need to sign these papers, Vanessa. It is for your own good. Barbara leaned down, her face pressing close to my ear. Her heavy, expensive perfume masked the toxic stench of her greed. Sign it right now, Barbara whispered, completely inaudible to the guests, or the men in white coats will be here in 10 minutes to drag you out in a straitjacket. Do not test me. I looked up at the crowd. The wealthy neighbors looked back at me with devastating pity. They were completely convinced they were witnessing a beautiful act of parental sacrifice. Mason stood by the bar, checking his gold watch, practically salivating at the thought of the $2 million wire transfer he was about to initiate the second my signature hit that page. Harrison walked over to the coffee table. He pulled a heavy, official-looking notary stamp from his briefcase and set it down next to the documents. He looked at me, his face a perfectly blank canvas, betraying absolutely nothing of our actual relationship. Miss, Harrison said, his voice carrying the strict, monotonous cadence of a legal official. I am required by the state of California to ask if you are signing this document of your own free will. Do you understand that by affixing your signature to this power of attorney, you are surrendering all legal and financial control of your estate to your father? The silence in the room was absolute. You could hear the distant crashing of the ocean waves through the open patio doors. Richard's hand gripped the back of my chair, his knuckles turning white with anticipation. Mason took a step forward, his breath held tight. Barbara's nails dug deeper into my collarbone. I looked at the gold-plated pen resting on the glass table. I looked at the sloppy, downloaded legal document that was supposed to act as my death warrant. I looked at the greedy, triumphant faces of the three people who had spent my entire life treating me like a disposable asset. They had laid all their cards on the table. They had confessed their crimes on my hidden microphones. They had committed identity theft with my credit cards. They had attempted to poison me with industrial sedatives. And now, they were attempting to execute the final stage of their extortion in front of a room full of federal witnesses. The performance was over. I reached out with a trembling right hand. My fingers brushed against the cool metal of the gold-plated pen. I heard Richard let out a shaky, triumphant exhale. I heard Barbara's grip loosen slightly on my shoulder. They thought they had won. I wrapped my fingers securely around the heavy barrel of the pen. I held the heavy gold-plated pen. The cool metal felt foreign against my skin, but it grounded me in the reality of the moment. Barbara exhaled a sharp breath of relief directly against the nape of my neck. She leaned closer, her expensive, overwhelming perfume suffocating me, and whispered an urgent command to just sign the paper so they could all get back to the celebration. Richard tapped his polished shoe against the hardwood floorboards, practically vibrating with eager anticipation to finalize the ultimate theft of my estate. Mason actually took a step toward the marble bar, signaling the bartender to prepare another round of my stolen vintage champagne. He was already celebrating his incoming $2 million wire transfer. They were entirely consumed by their own greed. I hovered the fine tip of the fountain pen mere millimeters over the dotted line on the fraudulent power of attorney document. The entire room held its collective breath. Retired judges, wealthy neighbors, predatory investors, and the hidden federal agents all watched the tip of that gold pen. It was the absolute pinnacle of their manipulation, the exact second they believed their grand illusion had become permanent reality. Then the violent trembling in my right hand ceased. It did not slow down gradually or fade away. It stopped with absolute mechanical precision. My fingers locked around the barrel of the pen with the steady, unbreakable grip of a woman who had spent a decade dismantling ruthless corporate empires. The fabricated, medicated fog in my eyes evaporated instantly. It was replaced immediately by a cold, calculating, and lethal clarity. I felt the physical shift radiate through my entire body, a surge of pure, unfiltered adrenaline replacing the facade of weakness. I rolled my shoulders back, snapping my spine into perfectly rigid alignment. I pushed my weight onto my legs and rose from the plush velvet armchair, ascending to my full height. I was no longer the hunched, shuffling, lobotomized shell they had paraded out of the shadows. I stood tall in my sleek black silk blouse, tailored slacks, and crimson stilettos. I towered over the glass coffee table, projecting the terrifying, undeniable aura of an apex predator stepping onto a battlefield. Barbara took a confused, stumbling step backward, her manicured hand slipping uselessly off my shoulder. Her mouth parted in a silent gasp. Richard blinked rapidly, his thick brow furrowing as he tried to comprehend the sudden drastic change in my physical demeanor. The docile, broken daughter he had just pitched to the crowd had vanished into thin air. I looked directly into my father's eyes. I did not offer a weak, subservient smile. I did not produce a tearful, begging plea. Instead, my lips curved into a sharp, terrifying smirk. I gave him a razor-sharp gaze that possessed enough venom to freeze the blood in his veins. I could see the exact microsecond his brain registered that something had gone catastrophically wrong. The smug confidence on his face fractured, replaced by the dawning horror of a man realizing he had just stepped onto a landmine. I raised my right hand, holding his expensive gold-plated pen high in the air for every single person in the massive living room to see. I held their attention hostage. Then with a forceful, deliberate, and violent downward motion, I threw the pen. It struck the solid marble floor of the foyer with a sharp, explosive crack. The loud clatter echoed like a gunshot through the vaulted ceilings of the living room, slicing cleanly through the suffocating hypocrisy of the gala. The heavy gold barrel shattered upon impact, sending pieces of expensive metal skittering across the floor and spilling dark black ink over the pristine white stone. The deafening sound paralyzed the entire estate. Several wealthy guests physically jumped in their evening wear. The string quartet players in the corner lowered their bows entirely, their eyes wide with shock. Absolute suffocating silence gripped the $4 million property. You could hear the ice melting in the champagne buckets. Richard stared down at the broken pen on the floor, his jaw going completely slack. He looked up at me, his mouth opening and closing repeatedly without producing a single coherent sound. The Grand Patriarch was suddenly rendered entirely speechless. Barbara clutched the stolen diamond necklace at her throat, her face draining of all color until it matched the white marble beneath our feet. She looked at me in raw, unfiltered horror, stepping further away, as if I had suddenly caught fire. The illusion she had meticulously crafted for her high society neighbors was disintegrating right before her eyes. Across the room, Mason froze halfway to the bar. His glass of stolen scotch hovered uselessly in the air, his arrogant smile melting into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. The golden boy realized his guaranteed escape fund had just shattered against the floor. I looked around the room, making deliberate eye contact with the wealthy neighbors who had pitied me moments ago. I saw David, the retired federal judge, narrow his eyes as he assessed the radical shift in the power dynamic. I saw Patricia covering her mouth in shock. The pity was gone, replaced by a gripping, breathless tension. I turned my razor-sharp gaze back to the man claiming to be my savior. "I am not signing a single thing, Richard," I stated. My voice was no longer a raspy, broken whisper begging for mercy. It was loud, crisp, and rang with lethal, undeniable authority. It carried easily to the furthest edges of the massive room, ensuring every single guest heard my declaration. "And I highly suggest you step away from my coffee table," I continued, taking a bold, aggressive step forward that forced Richard to retreat. "Before I have you arrested for attempted extortion in my own home." The grand performance was officially over. The pitiful victim they had constructed was dead. The real host of the evening had finally arrived to take the stage, and she was demanding absolute destruction. Richard stammered, his face turning an unhealthy shade of purple. He spun toward the audience, throwing his hands up in a desperate gesture of appeasement. "Please, everyone, forgive this outburst," Richard shouted, his voice trembling with forced authority. As I told you, she is suffering from severe paranoid delusions. The medication makes her combative. Barbara, call the medical transport team immediately. We need to get her to the facility. Barbara lunged towards her designer purse, her hands shaking so violently she dropped it onto the floor. I am calling them right now, she cried out, turning to the retired federal judge. David, you see what we have to deal with. She is completely detached from reality. I am perfectly attached to reality, I said, my voice slicing through the frantic noise of their panic. In fact, I am about to share that reality with everyone in this room. I reached into the pocket of my slacks and pulled out my smartphone. I did not break eye contact with my father as my thumb hovered over the screen. I tapped a single highly encrypted application icon. I pressed the execution command. Behind the custom marble bar, the massive 85-inch OLED television that had been displaying a serene screensaver of the California coast suddenly went pitch black. The ambient music playing through the estate's surround sound system cut off instantly. A sharp digital beep echoed through the vaulted ceilings, followed immediately by the undeniable high-definition audio of my brother's voice. It is a Ponzi scheme, Dad. It has always been a Ponzi scheme. Mason's panicked confession blasted through the hidden speakers, bouncing off the marble pillars and hitting the wealthy investors like a physical shockwave. On the massive screen, crystal-clear infrared footage from the hidden camera in the study illuminated the darkness. The guests watched in absolute paralyzed horror as a giant black-and-white projection of Mason frantically paced across my antique rug. I was paying the old investors with the new investors' money, but the well dried up, the recorded version of Mason screamed on the screen. I owe them $2 million. They are Russian syndicate offshoots. They already repossessed my car, and they know exactly where we are sleeping tonight. The three older gentlemen standing near the infinity pool, the very men Mason had just tried to hustle for $500,000, each physically recoiled. They stared at Mason, their expressions morphing from polite interest to absolute murderous rage. Mason dropped his empty glass of scotch. It shattered against the floor, but nobody even looked at him. They were entirely captivated by the broadcast of his spectacular criminality. Before Richard could even move to unplug the television, the video feed seamlessly transitioned to a new clip. This time it was broad daylight in the kitchen. The screen showed Barbara leaning over the marble island, handing me a plastic cup. I will increase the dosage on those sleeping pills she thinks are vitamins. Barbara's voice echoed through the speakers, loud and vicious. She will be a vegetable by the time your guests arrive. A collective gasp ripped through the audience of high society neighbors. Patricia, the woman who had praised my mother's saintly devotion just 24 hours ago, slapped a hand over her mouth in sheer terror. David, the retired federal judge, took a slow, deliberate step away from Richard, treating my father as if he were highly contagious. The broadcast did not stop. The screen shifted to the audio-visual recording of Richard holding his phone on speaker in the study. The sleazy voice of their hired attorney filled the room, outlining the exact method for legally kidnapping me. If she refuses to sign the POA willingly, we file the emergency petition and have her committed for a psychiatric evaluation. Once she is locked in a ward, she will do whatever you say. Richard let out a primal, desperate yell. He charged toward the television, frantically pulling at the cables behind the screen, tearing wires from the wall in a blind panic. The television screen finally went black, but it was far too late. The damage was irreparably done. The digital execution had been witnessed by dozens of influential people. I stepped into the dead center of the living room, commanding the space with absolute supremacy. You told these people I was an unemployed, depressed failure. I projected my voice, commanding the absolute attention of every single person present. You told them I was fired. You told them you bought this house to harbor your broken daughter. Let me officially introduce myself. I looked directly at Mason, who was currently backing away toward the patio doors, looking for an escape route that did not exist. I was never fired, I declared. I am a former crisis management director for a top-tier firm representing the Fortune 500. I specialized in neutralizing corporate espionage, mitigating federal scandals, and destroying predatory executives. 2 months ago, I sold my equity in that firm for $25 million. I bought this estate in cash to enjoy an early retirement. The revelation hit my family like a freight train. Barbara's knees actually buckled. She grabbed the edge of a velvet chair to keep from collapsing onto the floor. Her eyes were wide with a terror so profound it looked almost comical. Richard stood frozen by the dead television, his hands still clutching the torn cables, breathing heavily like a trapped animal. "You thought you were so incredibly clever," I mocked, taking a slow, predatory step toward my parents. "You thought you could walk into my home, drug my water, steal my identity, and forge a psychiatric hold to pay off your son's mafia gambling debts. Did you honestly believe your bargain bin manipulation tactics would work on a woman who dismantles hostile corporate takeovers for a living?" I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small, sealed plastic evidence bag containing the heavy sedatives Barbara had tried to force down my throat. I tossed it onto the glass coffee table right next to the shattered gold pen. "I did not swallow a single pill," I stated coldly. "I recorded every conversation. I traced the offshore accounts you used to hide your stolen money. I logged every piece of furniture you destroyed and every credit card you illegally charged. I turned my own home into a federal surveillance grid, and you walked right into it completely blind." The absolute silence of the room was broken only by the sound of Richard hyperventilating. He looked at the evidence bag on the table, then up at the wealthy crowd surrounding them. There was no sympathy left in the room. There was only the harsh, glaring spotlight of their exposed crimes. "You wanted a grand audience to witness my surrender," I said, a lethal smile gracing my lips. "I simply provided the venue. But the show is far from over." Mason's mind fractured. The sophisticated, smooth-talking CEO facade he had maintained all evening violently peeled away, exposing the terrified, cornered animal underneath. He looked at the three wealthy investors standing near the pool, the men who were supposed to be his $2 million salvation. They were already dialing their own attorneys. He looked at the shattered gold pen on the marble floor, and then his bloodshot eyes locked onto the smartphone in my hand. In his rapidly unraveling mind, that small device was the only thing standing between him and a shallow grave in the Nevada desert. He let out a visceral, completely unhinged scream. It was a sound stripped of all humanity, fueled by pure blinding panic and uncontrollable rage. "You ruined everything!" Mason roared, his voice cracking violently. He kicked a silver tray of caviar out of his path, sending expensive crystal and ice flying across the room. "I will kill you." He charged directly at me. His hands were outstretched, his fingers hooked into claws, aiming straight for my throat and the phone in my grip. He moved with the desperate, sloppy momentum of a man whose entire life had just gone up in flames. I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward. I did not even raise my arms to defend myself. I just stood my ground, maintaining my cold, unyielding stare, completely unfazed by his pathetic display of violence. I knew I did not have to lift a finger. Before Mason could close the final 3 feet between us, a blur of motion intercepted his path. Harrison, the quiet, unassuming man who had been standing patiently by the stone fireplace playing the role of a bureaucratic notary public, moved with terrifying kinetic efficiency. He did not step in front of me like a shield. He attacked with the calculated, devastating precision of a highly trained operative. Harrison seized Mason by the lapels of his stolen Tom Ford tuxedo. Using Mason's own reckless momentum against him, Harrison pivoted sharply, sweeping his leg behind Mason's knees. He drove his forearm hard into Mason's chest, executing a flawless, brutal tactical takedown. The impact was massive. Mason hit the solid marble floor with a sickening thud that forced all the air from his lungs in a sharp gasp. Before Mason could even process the pain or attempt to struggle, Harrison flipped him violently onto his stomach. He pinned Mason's left arm behind his back, locking the wrist at a painful angle that entirely neutralized any further resistance. Harrison drove a heavy knee firmly between Mason's shoulder blades, pinning the golden boy to the ground like a common street thug. "Get off him!" Barbara shrieked, her voice reaching a hysterical, glass-shattering pitch. She took a step toward the center of the room, her hands hovering uselessly in the air. "Are you crazy? Let my son go. Richard, do something. He is assaulting our boy." Richard, his face a mask of purple indignation, puffed out his chest and marched forward, attempting to summon whatever scraps of patriarchal authority he had left. "See here, you absolute maniac," Richard bellowed, pointing a trembling finger at the man kneeling on his son's back. "I hired you to notarize a document, not play security guard. I demand you release him this instant before I have you arrested for aggravated assault. You have no idea who you are dealing with." Harrison did not flinch at the threat. He did not loosen his iron grip on Mason's wrist. Instead, he calmly reached his free hand inside the breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He pulled out a dark leather wallet and flipped it open with a sharp snap of his wrist. A heavy gold federal shield gleamed under the light of the crystal chandeliers. "Actually, Richard, I know exactly who I am dealing with," Harrison stated, his voice ringing with absolute chilling authority. "Special Agent Harrison, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Financial Crimes Division, and I am not a notary public." The collective gasp from the surrounding high society guests was audible. The wealthy neighbors, the investors, and the catering staff all took a simultaneous step backward, putting as much physical distance as possible between themselves and my family. The word FBI acted like a localized earthquake, shattering the last remaining pillars of my parents' manufactured reality. Richard stopped dead in his tracks. His outstretched arm fell limply to his side. The aggressive, blustering patriarch deflated instantly, his posture crumbling as the sheer gravity of the situation crashed down upon him. He stared at the gold badge, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. Barbara let out a small, strangled whimper. She pressed her hands against her cheeks, her eyes darting frantically from the federal badge to her son writhing on the marble floor. Mason groaned, his face pressed uncomfortably against the cold stone. "Let me up," he whined, the arrogant CEO persona, completely replaced by the pathetic whimpering of a caught criminal. "You cannot do this. I have rights. You waived your rights the second you engaged in interstate wire fraud, extortion, and criminal conspiracy," Harrison informed him coldly, applying slightly more pressure to the joint lock to ensure absolute compliance. "You have been under active federal investigation for 6 months, Mason. We have been tracking every single unauthorized transfer you routed through the Cayman Islands. We know about the fake portfolios, we know about the forged appraisals, and we certainly know about the $2 million you currently owe to a violent organized crime syndicate in Las Vegas." Harrison leaned down, his voice dropping to a harsh, intimidating register that echoed perfectly across the silent room. "You are not a businessman, Mason. You are a highly desperate, extremely sloppy con artist. And as of this exact moment, you are under federal custody." I watched the scene unfold with profound, icy satisfaction. My brother, the golden child who had spent his entire life being shielded from the consequences of his own disastrous actions, was finally being held accountable. His expensive tuxedo was wrinkled and stained with spilled champagne. His face was pressed into the dirt, tracked in by his own dogs. The illusion of his brilliance was thoroughly and permanently dismantled. The investors by the pool were already speaking frantically into their phones, likely initiating immediate legal actions to freeze their exposed assets. The high society neighbors were whispering furiously among themselves, their faces masks of pure scandalized horror. My family's social standing in the Malibu community was not just ruined. It was actively burning to the ground, incinerated by the presence of federal law enforcement in my living room. I walked slowly toward where Harrison had Mason pinned to the floor. I looked down at my brother, my crimson stilettos stopping inches from his face. He rolled his eyes upward to look at me, his expression a pathetic mixture of profound hatred and abject terror. "You should have just taken the guest room downstairs, Mason," I said, my voice carrying a quiet, lethal edge. "But you got greedy. You all got greedy, and now you are going to pay the ultimate price." Mason twisted his neck awkwardly against the cold marble floor, his eyes darting frantically toward the infinity pool. He locked his desperate gaze on the 3 older, distinguished gentlemen he had just been pitching his life away to, the wealthy marks who were supposed to be his $2 million salvation. "Mr. Thompson, Mr. Gallagher," Mason gasped out, struggling uselessly under the crushing weight of the federal agent. "Tell him this is a misunderstanding. I have the pitch deck. I have the financial projections. I can make you all incredibly rich." You saw the estate. The three men did not look confused. They did not look alarmed by the presence of federal law enforcement. They looked down at the pathetic, squirming man on the floor with absolute, chilling disgust. "They are not going to save you." "Mason," a sharp, confident voice echoed from the edge of the crowd. Diana stepped out from the shadows of the patio doors. My best friend and ruthless real estate attorney looked immaculate in a tailored crimson blazer that perfectly matched my stilettos. She held a thick leather-bound portfolio in her hand. She walked to stand directly beside the three older gentlemen, her presence instantly unifying them into a single terrifying front against my family. "Let me properly introduce the guests of honor you have been trying to hustle all evening," Diana announced, her voice ringing clear and loud across the silent living room. She gestured gracefully to the men standing beside her. "This is Edward Thompson," Diana stated. "You stole his entire retirement fund 2 years ago to buy your first sports car. This is William Gallagher, whose family business you bankrupted with your fake algorithms. And this is Richard Peterson, who lost his daughter's college fund to your offshore shell companies." The blood completely drained from Mason's face. The arrogant CEO illusion shattered into microscopic pieces. He stopped struggling against Harrison, his body going completely limp with the sheer crushing weight of the realization. "They are not new investors," I added, stepping closer to my brother. "I used the stolen client roster you carelessly left on my antique desk to send out highly encrypted anonymous VIP invitations. I brought them here tonight so they could watch the man who destroyed their lives get exactly what he deserves. They did not bring checkbooks, Mason. They brought their legal representation." Diana dropped the heavy leather portfolio directly in front of Mason's face on the marble floor. It landed with a loud smack. "That is a multi-million-dollar class action civil lawsuit," Diana informed him coldly. "It will run concurrently with your federal criminal indictment. We are going to seize every single asset you have ever touched, including the cheap shoes currently on your feet." Barbara let out a high-pitched, hysterical shriek. The reality of her son's utter destruction was finally bypassing her monumental delusion. She spun around wildly, her hands grabbing at the air as she desperately searched for a lifeline among the wealthy faces in the crowd. She locked eyes on the older neighbor who had attended her fake garden tea party. "David." "Patricia, please," Barbara cried out, running toward the retired federal judge and his wife. "You have to stop this. We are respected members of this community. This is a targeted setup. Call the local police and have these trespassers removed. They are ruining our housewarming party." David did not offer her a comforting smile. He did not extend a hand to reassure the weeping matriarch. He looked at Barbara with an expression of pure, unadulterated contempt. He reached inside the breast pocket of his tailored evening jacket and slowly pulled out a thick stack of legal papers stamped with bright red ink. "We do not need to call the local police," Barbara David said, his voice booming with strict judicial authority, "because as the acting president of this community's homeowners association, I am the one who explicitly authorized the federal agents to bypass the security gates tonight." Barbara stopped dead in her tracks, stumbling backward as if she had been physically struck. Patricia stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with her husband. The sweet, sympathetic neighbor act she had played during the tea party was entirely gone, replaced by the fierce, protective anger of a community leader. "We are the executive board of the Malibu Property Owners Coalition," Patricia stated firmly. "When Vanessa informed us that a family of squatters was planning to conduct illegal securities fraud on community grounds, we called an emergency board meeting." David unfolded the heavy legal document, holding it up for Richard and Barbara to see. "This is a legally binding, immediate eviction mandate," David declared, his voice carrying the finality of a judge delivering a sentence. "You have violated over a dozen community bylaws in the span of 3 days. You brought untrained, aggressive animals onto the property, causing significant noise complaints. You caused severe structural damage to a historic estate. And worst of all, you are actively running an illegal commercial enterprise on residential grounds." Richard puffed out his chest, trying to summon the blustering patriarchal rage that had worked for him his entire life. "You cannot evict us," Richard bellowed, his face turning bright red. "We are her parents. We have squatters' rights. I know the law in California. You have to give us a 30-day notice." Diana laughed, a sharp, mocking sound that cut through his arrogant tirade. Squatters' rights do not apply when the occupants are actively committing federal felonies on the premises, Richard. And they certainly do not apply when the primary tenant has filed a restraining order against you for attempted medical extortion. David took 2 aggressive steps forward and slammed the eviction notice directly against Richard's chest. Richard instinctively grabbed the papers, his hands shaking violently as he looked at the official red stamps and the legal signatures. "You have exactly 10 minutes to vacate these premises before you are formally charged with criminal trespassing," David ordered, pointing a stern finger toward the front door. "Your gate access has already been permanently revoked. Your vehicle is currently being towed from the driveway because it is parked in a designated fire lane. You are leaving this neighborhood tonight, and you are never coming back." The absolute finality of the trap snapped shut. Every single exit was blocked. Every single lie they had told had been weaponized against them. The wealthy neighbors they had desperately tried to impress were actually the executioners of their social and residential demise. I walked slowly up to Barbara, who was hyperventilating, her hands clutching her chest as she looked around the room. The catering staff had stopped serving. The string quartet had packed up their instruments. Dozens of influential people were staring at her with unabashed disgust. "You wanted to impress high society, Mom," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying enough venom to shatter her remaining sanity. "You wanted to play the wealthy matriarch. You wanted to host the most exclusive event of the season to prove how much better you are than me. Well, congratulations, you succeeded. You are the main attraction of the biggest scandal this neighborhood has ever seen. Now get out of my house." Before Barbara could even process the eviction command, a piercing, high-pitched wail shattered the coastal silence. The unmistakable shriek of multiple police sirens echoed down the private drive of the gated community. Bright flashes of red and blue light violently illuminated the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting harsh, strobing shadows across the terrified faces of my family. The heavy oak front doors did not just open, they were breached. A squad of local Malibu police officers, fully geared and moving with tactical precision, stormed into the grand foyer. They were flanked by 2 more federal agents wearing dark tactical jackets. The visual collision of armed law enforcement boots trampling over the imported floral arrangements and pristine marble floors was a masterpiece of absolute destruction. "Nobody move," the lead officer commanded, his voice booming over the chaos. Harrison, still pinning Mason to the ground, gave a sharp nod to the incoming officers. 2 officers moved in instantly. They hauled my brother up from the floor, his expensive stolen tuxedo now a ruined, wrinkled mess. Mason's legs wobbled like jelly. He could not even support his own weight as the officers slammed him forcefully against the custom marble bar. The sharp metallic clatter of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting around Mason's wrists was the most beautiful symphony I had ever heard. Mason, Harrison announced, stepping back and brushing off his suit jacket. "You are under arrest for interstate wire fraud, securities fraud, and conspiracy to commit money laundering. You have the right to remain silent, which I strongly suggest you use, considering you have been running your mouth on a federal wiretap for the past 48 hours. Mason sobbed openly, the tears streaming down his face, as his wrists were locked behind his back. The arrogant CEO, who had just demanded millions of dollars from vulnerable investors, was crying like a helpless toddler. Richard, seeing his golden boy in handcuffs, finally snapped out of his paralyzed stupor. He lunged forward, puffing out his chest in a desperate, foolish attempt to physically intervene. "Get your hands off my son!" Richard bellowed, his face contorting with blind rage. "We are respectable citizens. You are trespassing on our property." Before Richard could take another step, 2 federal agents intercepted him. They grabbed his arms, twisting them swiftly and painfully behind his back. Richard let out a loud, pathetic yelp as he was shoved face first against the nearest marble pillar. The second set of handcuffs clicked shut with brutal finality. Richard, the lead federal agent, stated coldly, reading from a document pulled from his tactical vest. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit property fraud, attempted extortion, and grand theft. Furthermore, we are adding severe identity theft to your list of federal offenses." Richard pressed his cheek against the cold pillar, his eyes bulging in sheer panic. Identity theft. That is an outrageous lie. I have never stolen an identity in my life. I took a slow, deliberate step toward my father, my heels clicking sharply against the floor. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the thick stack of receipts Diana had printed for me earlier that day. I slapped the papers directly against Richard's chest. "You stole my primary platinum credit card from my biometric safe," I said, my voice dripping with absolute lethal precision. "You used it to fraudulently authorize $50,000 to a luxury event planner. You swiped it for $12,000 worth of imported flowers. And you personally signed a $15,000 receipt at a high-end boutique in Beverly Hills to purchase the exact tuxedo you are currently wearing while being arrested. You committed federal identity theft to fund a party designed to steal my house." Richard's mouth opened, but no words came out. The undeniable proof of his pathetic, desperate criminality was literally stapled to his chest. The wealthy guests watching the spectacle murmured in deep, profound disgust. To the elite circles of Malibu, financial desperation was a sin, but stealing from your own supposedly mentally unstable daughter to buy a suit was a social crime beyond redemption. The federal agent pulled the stolen platinum credit card from Richard's inner pocket, holding it up as physical evidence. "We have the surveillance footage from the boutique, Richard. We have the phone recordings of you bypassing the bank's security protocols. You are looking at a mandatory minimum sentence before we even touch the real estate fraud." Mason, watching his father get arrested, completely lost his mind. He began thrashing against the officers holding him, screaming wildly. "It was his idea," Mason shrieked, pointing his cuffed hands toward Richard. "My dad told me to leverage the house. My dad told me to drug her. I just needed a loan to pay off the Vegas guys, but he orchestrated the entire psychiatric hold. He is the mastermind." The absolute cowardice was staggering. The moment the federal handcuffs clicked shut, the unbreakable family loyalty they constantly preached about vanished instantly. The golden child was throwing his own father under the bus to shave a few years off his federal sentence. Richard whipped his head around, staring at his son in pure, unfiltered betrayal. "Shut your mouth, Mason," Richard snarled, spit flying from his lips. "I ruined my entire life trying to cover up your pathetic, failing business. I lost my house because of your gambling debts. Do not you dare blame me for your incompetence." They were tearing each other apart in the middle of my living room, doing the prosecution's job for them. Harrison simply nodded to the officers, letting the two criminals confess their conspiracy loudly in front of a room full of federal witnesses. The lead officer tightened his grip on Richard's collar. "You can save the family therapy session for the federal holding cell. Let us go." They began marching Richard and Mason toward the shattered front doors. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated their disgraced, ruined faces. The wealthy investors they had tried to scam actively stepped aside, creating a wide, humiliating corridor for the criminals to walk through. The caterers, the musicians, and the HOA board members watched in absolute silence as the two men were dragged out of the massive estate in disgrace. I stood in the center of the living room, watching the flashing police lights cast long shadows across the walls. The air in the house suddenly felt infinitely lighter. The heavy, suffocating presence of their manipulation was being physically removed from my property. I had executed the crisis management protocol perfectly, turning their own greed into a perfectly sealed federal trap. The front doors remained wide open, the cool ocean breeze sweeping through the grand foyer, chasing out the stale stench of my father's cigar smoke and the lingering tension. The flashing police lights continued to paint the walls in frantic strokes of red and blue, fading only slightly as the squad cars holding my father and brother began to idle in the driveway. The wealthy investors and the HOA board members stood in stunned silence, watching the first half of the spectacle conclude. But the silence inside the living room was suddenly shattered by a sound so guttural and pathetic it barely registered as human. Barbara was still standing near the crushed velvet armchair. She looked at the empty doorway where her husband and her golden child had just been dragged away in federal handcuffs. Her eyes were wide, bloodshot, and completely devoid of the aristocratic arrogance she had worn like a suit of armor just 10 minutes ago. The heavy diamond necklace stolen directly from my personal safe hung crookedly against her collarbone. It was a glaring, sparkling symbol of her profound failure. She slowly turned her head toward me. The realization of her absolute ruin crashed over her in real time. The mansion was not hers. The money was not hers. The high society status she desperately craved was dead. All she had left was the daughter she had spent 34 years systematically destroying. Barbara let out a high-pitched, vibrating wail. She did not walk toward me. She practically collapsed forward, her knees hitting the hard marble floor with a sickening crack. She crawled across the distance separating us, the expensive fabric of her stolen designer gown, tearing against the sharp shards of the shattered gold pen scattered across the tiles. She threw her arms forward, wrapping her hands tightly around my ankles. Her manicured nails dug into the fabric of my black slacks. She pressed her tear-stained face against my shoes, weeping with a chaotic, unhinged desperation that made the remaining guests physically recoil in absolute disgust. "Vanessa, please!" Barbara wailed, her voice thick with panic and smeared makeup. "You have to stop them. You have to tell the federal agents it was all a massive misunderstanding. You cannot let them take your father and your brother to federal prison. They will not survive in there. We are your family. We are your flesh and blood." I looked down at the woman gripping my ankles. I felt absolutely nothing. No pity. No remorse. Not even the lingering ghost of daughterly obligation. I was staring at a parasite that had finally run out of a host to feed on. "Get off of me, Mom," I commanded, my voice dropping to a flat Arctic tone. I did not kick her away, but I took a firm, deliberate step backward. The sudden movement forced her to release her grip or risk being dragged across the floor. She slumped forward, her hands bracing against the cold marble, looking up at me with streaming, desperate eyes. "You cannot do this to us," Barbara sobbed, reaching out a trembling hand as if trying to grasp my pant leg again. "I am your mother. I gave you life. I raised you. I sacrificed my own youth so you could have a future. You owe me this much. You cannot just throw your own mother onto the street. We are family, Vanessa. Family forgives each other." The sheer audacity of her moral manipulation was staggering, but completely expected. Even now, facing federal prison and absolute bankruptcy, her default defense mechanism was aggressive manipulation. She was trying to weaponize the biological connection she had abused my entire life to save her own skin. I kept my spine perfectly straight. I reached my right hand into the pocket of my slacks. My fingers bypassed my smartphone and the digital audio transmitter, finding the small, crisp piece of paper I had kept folded in my wallet for over a decade. I pulled it out and slowly unfolded it. It was a single, slightly faded $200 bill. I held the crisp bill up between my index and middle finger. I let it catch the glaring light of the chandelier above us. Barbara stopped sobbing for a fraction of a second, her greedy eyes instinctively locking onto the currency before deep confusion set in. "Do you recognize this, Mom?" I asked, my voice carrying clearly through the silent room. Barbara shook her head, fresh tears continuing to ruin her expensive makeup. "I do not understand. What is that? Please, Vanessa, just call the police and tell them to bring your brother back right now." I took one step closer, towering over her kneeling form. 15 years ago, I reminded her the absolute authority in my tone, forcing her to listen. I was 19 years old. The bank was threatening to drop my university enrollment because you and Richard drained my college savings account to pay off Mason's very first gambling debt. I came to you crying, begging for a cosigner on a student loan so I would not be kicked out of my dormitory. Barbara swallowed hard, her eyes darting nervously toward the HOA board members who were listening to every single word. "Do you remember what you did?" I asked, my voice slicing through her pathetic attempts to formulate a lie. "You laughed at me. You told me I was not smart enough to warrant a financial investment. You told me to drop out and get a job as a waitress to support my brilliant brother's future. And then you threw exactly $200 in cash at my face and told me to buy a bus ticket out of your sight." I released the bill. The $200 fluttered slowly through the air, drifting side to side before landing dead center on Barbara's tear-soaked cheek. It slid down her face and settled on the marble floor right between her hands. "That was the only financial contribution you ever made to my survival," I stated, stepping back and looking down at her with ultimate crushing finality. "I kept that specific bill for 15 years, as a reminder to never rely on you again. I paid for my own education. I built my own multi-million-dollar company. I bought this $4 million estate with my own blood, sweat, and tears. You did not give me a future. I built my future in spite of you. Barbara stared at the money on the floor, her chest heaving with frantic, shallow breaths. She reached out her fingers, trembling violently, but she did not touch the bill. She looked back up at me, her mouth opening to deploy another barrage of maternal guilt, but I cut her off instantly. Family is supposed to protect you, I declared, projecting my voice to ensure the federal agent standing by the door heard my official statement. Family does not drug your water with heavy sedatives. Family does not forge psychiatric holds to steal your property. Family does not leverage your home to pay off the Russian mafia. You are not my mother. You are just a criminal who happened to share my DNA, and as of tonight, that biological technicality is permanently revoked. Barbara let out another high-pitched wail, burying her face in her hands, as the finality of my words struck her. The manipulation had failed completely. The guilt trip had bounced off an impenetrable wall of hard, undeniable facts. I had stripped away her last remaining weapon. I turned my gaze toward the two local Malibu police officers standing near the shattered front doors. I gave them a short, decisive nod. "Officers," I said calmly, pointing directly at the woman weeping on my floor. "This individual was officially served an eviction notice by the Homeowners Association 30 minutes ago. Her gate access is revoked. I do not want her on my property for another second. Please remove her for criminal trespassing." The officers did not hesitate. They marched across the foyer, their heavy boots crunching over the broken pieces of the gold pen. They grabbed Barbara by her arms, hauling her roughly to her feet. She shrieked, kicking her designer heels against the floorboards, fighting the officers with the frantic energy of a cornered rat. "You cannot do this," Barbara screamed as they dragged her toward the exit. "I am your mother. You owe me. You are nothing without us. You will die alone." I did not flinch. I did not blink. I stood perfectly still, watching her thrash and scream as the officers pulled her out into the cold night air. The heavy oak doors swung shut behind her, cutting off her hysterical screaming with a solid, satisfying thud. The flashing red and blue lights reflecting through the windows slowly faded away as the police cruisers rolled down the driveway, taking the last remnants of my toxic family out of my life forever. The silence that descended upon the estate was absolute. It was not the heavy, suffocating silence of walking on eggshells that I had endured my entire childhood. It was the crisp, immaculate silence of a battlefield after a decisive, flawless victory. The toxic infection that had plagued my existence for 34 years was finally surgically extracted from my home. Diana and Harrison stepped forward from the shadows of the foyer. Diana placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder, her usually sharp features softening with genuine pride. Harrison slipped his federal badge back into his jacket pocket, giving me a short, respectful nod. The remaining guests, the retired judges, the wealthy neighbors, the investors who had narrowly escaped financial ruin, quietly made their way toward the exit. None of them offered empty platitudes. They simply offered me polite, deeply deferential nods as they passed. They had witnessed a master class in crisis management, and they knew better than to say a single word that might offend the architect of the evening's destruction. By the time the final catering truck pulled out of my driveway, the legal machinery we had set in motion was already grinding my family into dust. The justice system moves slowly for some, but when you hand federal prosecutors a perfectly wrapped package of wire fraud, tax evasion, and attempted extortion on a silver platter, the gears turn with terrifying speed. Diana immediately filed a permanent injunction legally barricading my estate and my financial portfolios from any future frivolous claims my family might attempt to leverage. My perimeter was rendered entirely impenetrable. Mason did not even make it to bail. The moment the federal agents transported him to holding, they presented him with the offshore wire transfer requests and the recorded audio confessions from my living room. His high-priced defense attorneys took one look at the mountain of irrefutable evidence and immediately advised him to take a plea deal. But the federal prosecutors were not in a negotiating mood. They wanted to make a public example out of the arrogant tech bro who had mercilessly defrauded elderly pensioners. The federal judge showed zero leniency. Mason was sentenced to 10 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. Ironically, federal prison was the safest place for him to be. The moment the Russian syndicate in Las Vegas realized their $2 million payment had been intercepted and seized by the FBI, they put a massive target on his back. Mason traded his tailored luxury tuxedos for an orange jumpsuit, spending his days looking over his shoulder in constant paranoid terror. The golden child, who had been coddled and shielded his entire life, was finally learning how the real world operates when nobody is there to bail you out. Richard fared no better. While he narrowly avoided a lengthy prison sentence by pleading guilty to conspiracy and heavily cooperating with the IRS regarding the offshore shell companies, his life was completely obliterated. The federal government seized every remaining asset he had hidden away to pay off the victims of Mason's scheme. Richard was forced to declare total catastrophic bankruptcy. The court handed him 5 years of heavily monitored probation. He was permanently barred from ever holding a corporate executive position or managing financial assets again. The blustering patriarch, who had loved to humiliate me over dinner, was reduced to bagging groceries at a discount hardware store just to make his court-ordered restitution payments. He lost his country club memberships, his expensive cigars, and his arrogance. He became a hollowed-out shell of a man crushed under the immense weight of his own profound ego. But Barbara's punishment was perhaps the most poetic of all. She did not face federal prison time, as her role was largely contained to the attempted medical extortion and identity theft, which Diana successfully leveraged to secure a lifetime restraining order. Instead, Barbara was sentenced to a psychological prison entirely of her own making, social annihilation. The story of her spectacular arrest at my Malibu estate spread through the high society circles of Southern California like wildfire. The wealthy neighbors she had tried so desperately to impress blacklisted her completely. When she tried to reach out to her old bridge club friends for a temporary loan, they instantly blocked her number. When she showed up at a charity luncheon trying to pretend the arrest was all a massive misunderstanding, security forcibly escorted her off the manicured premises. Without Richard's income or Mason's stolen funds, Barbara was forced to move into a rundown one-bedroom motel on the noisy outskirts of the city. She had no designer clothes left, no imported tea, no audience to manipulate, and no daughter to use as a scapegoat. She spent her days sitting in a cramped, humid room, entirely alone, staring at peeling wallpaper. She had spent her entire life stepping on other people to elevate her own status, and now she was at the absolute bottom of the food chain. She had nothing, and she was nobody. As for me, I did not waste another second thinking about their misery. My focus was entirely on reclaiming the peace they had tried to steal. I spent the remainder of that Saturday night alone in my massive, quiet house. I did not hire a cleaning crew. I wanted to erase their presence with my own 2 hands. I started in the foyer. I grabbed a broom and swept up the shattered pieces of the gold-plated pen, dumping the expensive fragments directly into the trash where they belonged. I scrubbed the black ink stain out of the pristine white marble until the floor gleamed flawlessly under the chandelier. I walked into the kitchen and threw away the cheap diet sodas and frozen dinners Barbara had shoved into my refrigerator. I wiped down the marble counters, resetting the heart of my home. I moved through the living room, opening all the glass patio doors to let the crisp, salty ocean breeze flush the stale smell of Richard's cigar smoke out of the upholstery. By the time I finished purging the house of their toxic residue, the digital clock on my oven read 5:30 in the morning. The deep, inky blackness of the night sky was just beginning to soften at the edges. I walked over to my professional espresso machine. The rhythmic mechanical hum of the grinder crushing fresh coffee beans was a comforting, grounding sound. I pulled a perfect, rich double shot of espresso, the dark crema swirling beautifully in my favorite ceramic mug. The bold, earthy aroma filled the kitchen, completely overriding any remaining trace of the chaos that had transpired hours earlier. I took the warm mug in my hands and walked straight through the living room, stepping out onto the expansive teak deck. The air was crisp and incredibly clean. I walked to the edge of the glass balcony, resting my hands on the cool railing, and looked out over the Pacific Ocean. The horizon was bleeding from dark violet into brilliant shades of crimson gold and pale blue. The sun was breaking over the water, casting a blinding, magnificent light across the rolling waves. I took a slow, deep sip of the espresso. The bitter, complex flavor grounded me in the present moment. I closed my eyes and took a massive breath of the salty ocean air, letting it fill my lungs completely. There was no yelling. There were no manipulative threats. There were no fake pills, no forged documents, and no toxic expectations dragging me down. There was only the sound of the ocean and the steady, unbreakable beating of my own heart. I opened my eyes and watched the sun fully crest over the horizon, bathing my $4 million estate in warm golden light. I had fought the hardest battle of my life, not in a corporate boardroom, but in my own living room. I had faced the monsters of my childhood, and I had utterly destroyed them. I was 34 years old. I was completely financially independent. I was standing on the balcony of my dream home, entirely safe and completely untouchable. For the first time in my entire life, I was absolutely unconditionally free. The story of Vanessa stands as a masterclass in establishing and enforcing absolute boundaries against toxic family dynamics. The most profound lesson we can extract from this narrative is that biological connection does not grant anyone a free pass to exploit, manipulate, or abuse you. Society often conditions us to believe the narrative that family is everything, and that we must endlessly forgive the transgressions of our parents or siblings simply because we share DNA. However, Vanessa's journey fiercely dismantles this harmful myth. When faced with a family that viewed her solely as a disposable asset to cover their own spectacular failures, she didn't react with the emotional breakdown they anticipated. Instead, she responded with cold, calculated clarity. She recognized that her worth was not defined by the conditional approval of an arrogant mother or an enabling father. The core lesson here centers on the immense power of self-worth and the realization that walking away from a toxic environment is not an act of cruelty, it is the ultimate act of self-preservation. True family is built on mutual respect, unwavering support, and genuine love, not extortion, gaslighting, or financial theft. Vanessa's ability to remain emotionally detached while methodically destroying their web of lies teaches us that we are the sole architects of our own peace. You cannot heal in the exact same environment that broke you, and sometimes the only way to protect your future is to surgically remove the people who are actively trying to tear it down. Letting go of the guilt associated with cutting off abusive relatives is the first step toward true freedom. Take a moment today to evaluate the boundaries in your own relationships and dare to cut ties with any toxicity that threatens your hard-earned peace.